Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the Embellish Pod, an opportunity for me to ramble about whiskey or something for a few minutes. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com and I'll get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's also a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today, I'm going to have Nick Taylor from Found North joining me. It's going to be a long one. We're going to have a lot of conversation. The variation of conversation is going to be pretty significant, but I think that it's super interesting what these guys are doing, and the product that they're creating is very, very top notch. So I hope you guys enjoy what we have today. This afternoon, I have Nick Taylor from Found North joining me. Nick, thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to chat with you. Thank you for the samples. If you would, just kind of give us the elevator speech on what Found North is, and then we'll kind of dive into it.
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on the show. And just pleased to chat with you in general. I'm Nick Taylor. I'm the head blender of Found North. Um, Found North is the elevator pitch is a bunch of American guys who are making Canadian whiskey, and taking advantage of the fact that Canadian whiskey is designed to be blended, which means we have a lot of freedom to blend it more to a style that is pervasive in the United States. And that doesn't just mean like, hey, we're making Canadian whiskey that tastes like bourbon, though that's often what people will say. It's more along the lines of we like bigger flavors, we like a little bit more wood, we like cast strength, we like non-chill filter, we like no additives. That's the elevator pitch. There's obviously a bigger story behind it, and there's a lot more that that's kind of the cool thing about starting this. Was it started small. It started as a very small idea. We're still a small company, but as you kind of see what you can make and you get the feedback from people, you have the opportunity to take it in new and interesting directions, and that's kind of how this thing has evolved to what it is today.
Yeah, and so you touched on a handful of different things there, and,
Yeah.
I've done a good amount of research on Found North as I often do, and I distinctly remember when you guys sort of hit the market. I didn't know what to think, right? Because every brand out there has this, really, really conflated story about, how they came to be. And you guys felt like you hit the market about the same time several other companies who weren't focusing on their backstory, but more focusing on we want to deliver a product that does a specific thing, right? We're not,
Mm,
my grandmother's yeast from her sourdough that we're making something, which there are brands that do that. And there's not necessarily anything wrong because it does add some mystique to it. But it's almost like a counterculture move that felt like that happened right around the time that you guys hit. But also, like, there's this really, really broad marketplace that existed. So, what put you in a position where you're like, hey, I want to chisel out a piece of this particular marketplace for my own brand? Like, what
yeah.
put you in that like mindset? Because it's not everybody does that. Some people are like, this is whiskey's great, and then that's it.
Yeah. No, I that's a great question. I feel like on a personal level, just because look, this was started by my brother and myself and a couple other guys on our team who've been with us before we actually launched Found North. Um, so on a personal level, I think for us there was we've gotten a lot of pushback. Like, why didn't you? You're a bunch of American guys. Why don't you just go to MGP and just make? There's great whiskey in America. Why aren't you sourcing from America and making American whiskey for Americans? Like, what the hell are a bunch of American dudes going up to Canada for? Um, and I think for us, beside the desire to have our own brand and launch our own whiskey, which has been something my brother and I have wanted to do for years before we started Found North. Um, it was important to us that we made whiskey that uh, affects the industry, even if it's only in a small way. And what I mean by that is like I'm a huge whiskey geek. I've been into whiskey for 10 years, way before we started making it. And my fascination with whiskey is rooted in how certain things we've made as a as a category, certain things that have been made, certain things that have happened in the industry over the last 200 years completely shaped the way that we make and consume and enjoy whiskey. Um, you look at things like Aeneas Coffee introducing the coffee still, the column still to the Scots, and it completely changes the whole the epicenter of whiskey moved from Ireland to Scotland largely because of this one thing that happened. Um, and I think like there are lots of smaller versions of that. There are lots of little things that happen over the course of people developing brands, people developing ways of making whiskey that shape what we do and what we drink. And we're not so arrogant to think that we're gonna like reshape whiskey, right? But making a premium Canadian whiskey is interesting because the premium Canadian category is relatively non-existent in the U.S., at least with the consumers that frankly we are. That's the funny, like the we wanted to make Canadian whiskey that we want to drink,
Mhm.
and and if as a result that makes people reconsider Canadian a little bit, and frankly makes the Canadian producers rethink what's possible in terms of making stuff that really suits this market. That would be needle moving in a way that being the umpteenth MGP brand just wouldn't possibly do. And to be totally fair, like I absolutely love MGP. I
Mhm.
think MGP makes some of the best whiskey in the world. I'm obsessed. I just don't think there's a great opportunity to make um, really relevant whiskey as a thousandth brand that's doing it.
Mhm.
I just that was one of the big draws of Canadian. Um, but then there was also the liquid draw. Um, Canadian whiskey Canadian whiskey doesn't have the best reputation in the US. But from a distillate standpoint, they actually make really, really high quality liquid. Um, they just make it they just make it in a way that optimizes the flavor creation for the back end of the process instead of the front end of the process. So as a producer, as a non-distilling producer, we have we have a lot more flexibility to control the final product. If you're buying from Bardstown, or you're buying from Heaven Hill, you're buying from MGP, you can do some stuff to really modify the flavors, but it's way limited compared to Canadian whiskey, where it's like, hey, here are your raw ingredients. We can recast them, we can blend them at whatever ratio, whatever grain ratio. They do 100 different distillation types, right? There's so much more levers that we can pull on the back end to actually be somebody that to be a group of guys who are affecting the flavor of the product instead of just buying and reselling it.
So I like that, and we're going to come back to grain ratio and a handful of other things. But you touched on this. Canadian whiskey historically could be kind of divisive in the North American marketplace, and it feels like about the time that you guys are entering into the marketplace. I look at, there was a ton of people that were putting out MGP, but they had access to some more aged MGP stocks at that point in time because
Mm,
they had been stockpiling for a while and people weren't sourcing nearly as much. And now those aged stocks are dwindling. And so we're seeing a lot of 4, 5, 6, 7 year MGP whiskey. And if you're wanting something that's older, it felt like at that point in time, you have two options. You have Tennessee or Canada. Those are the two options to get significant age statements. And this is the thing that it feels like it exists in the whiskey marketplaces. We're all hunting age statement, right?
mhm.
And you made the choice to Canadian whiskey, which has, I don't know that this is intentional. Maybe I'm imagining this, but you can make this choice towards Canadian whiskey, which has maybe less of, at that point in time, a negative connotation than Tennessee whiskey does because minerality and Dickel and all these things that people
Mhm,
sort of get
mhm.
wrapped up in. But you have the ability to produce significantly aged stocks at a reasonable value that is it finds that perfect vein for whiskey geeks, right? And the volume
Totally.
that you're doing currently. Was that a part of the plan, or is that just you found your way to this, or
Yeah, I would say we were less chasing age statement from a value proposition standpoint than from a quality standpoint. And this has been, the funny thing that like my background, I started in whiskey as a whiskey buyer for a chain of retail stores in Boston. And it was a really fascinating time to be buying and selling whiskey because it was like, particularly things like Scotch, it was really the beginning of NAS movement, right? So if you look at other markets where if you look at other markets historically where Scotch and whiskey didn't have as big a dip as they had in the 80s and 90s in the US, like Europe, they have historically been less age statement obsessed. Um, it was really age statement took hold as this marker of quality um, when there was just so much single malt and the single malt producers were trying to figure out like how the hell do we sell this as a premium
Mhm.
and really that was when you started seeing like the Diageo, all of the 16-year Lagavulin, the 18-year Taliskers, things like that starting to come out. And they're pushing this notion that age equals quality, which isn't entirely true. It's not entirely true in my experience. But what happened by 2014 when I was selling single malt was they had run out of all the old stuff. And so then all of a sudden, all these NASs are hitting the market and the messaging completely flipped. And it was like, age doesn't matter. Age doesn't matter. Age doesn't matter. So, for 10 years, I've been trying to pursue this notion of how important is age to quality. And the conclusion that I've come to is that um, age doesn't necessarily mean that the liquid will be quality, but age often means that the liquid itself will have access to flavor that needs to develop over time through an oxidative process, through really just the interaction of the spirit with oxygen, with air, not just the interaction with wood. And so the part of the appeal of Canadian whiskey, of course, is like, hey, we can buy older stuff at a much more reasonable price than what you're finding in the US. But more so, and more importantly than that, was particularly the ryes that we started looking at, the original ryes that we're using that were 16, 17 years old. Man, they had fruit and florality and flavors that you just don't find in US rye because
Mhm.
there wasn't any that was old enough, one, and
Right.
two, it's almost always completely nuked with oak by the time it hits 16, 17 years old, and the tannic acid and all of the sort of heavy wood compounds have completely taken over to the point where if you get some residual fruit, you're like, hallelujah. Whereas with
Mhm.
Canadian, when we were looking at these components where it was like, hey, we've got this in 13 years in refill bourbon, and then we put it for 4 years in an ex Speyside Scotch cask or a wheated bourbon cask or a Hungarian oak, the stuff that we were buying early on, we were like, this rye component is completely unique to the market, which means we can create whiskey that is flavorful, it's differentiated, and good, right? Of course, the number one thing we care about is making the liquid good, is making good
Mhm.
whiskey. Um, but once you have that, the next thing you want is you want good whiskey that's not a bottle that you could buy some other brand of and have almost the same flavor profile, right? You want to make whiskey that's good, but you also want to make whiskey that pushes the envelope at least a little bit. And that was what the age was doing for us beyond the value proposition of, hey, we've got old stuff for not $500. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, and you made a point in there, and I think this is the first time that I've heard it kind of communicated as efficiently. Is that we all know that age doesn't equal quality, but from a consumer standpoint, we're believing right is that these master blenders or distillers are tasting whiskey and saying this is continuing to get better and better over time, and so if it is 17 years, that means for 17 years it got better, and what you communicate in here is that it's because it's had enough time to access flavors that only come from that age. But we're also buying in a time when people are very interested in purchasing whiskey. But a lot of times, at least within the last 10 years, we're buying whiskey that was put on the shelf and put in a rick house and no one was interested in buying for a long time. To your
Yeah.
point, right? Like the 20-year-old Pappy was sitting on the shelf 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
No one cared about it. No one wanted to buy it. And it got an advanced age statement because it was just sitting around. It wasn't doing anything else. And so we're looking at it with the perspective of now, but not realizing that this occurred 20 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever, whenever nobody wanted to buy it, right? And so you, there's two facets that go in here that, yes, sometimes it does look better. And then when we look at Canadian whiskey, you know, aging in Canada is distinctly different than Kentucky or Tennessee or Texas for that matter. You know,
Yep.
like all of these things are different. And so it can age, I don't want to say the same, but more similarly to Scotch, where 20 years is not going to destroy the inside of your mouth when you finally go to drink it. Whereas
Yep.
if you have a 20-year bourbon that is at cask strength from Kentucky, good luck drinking that, right? Like, 'cause if you drink that at cask strength, it's going to taste like you're chewing on a piece of wood.
Yes. All right. You made like 3 points that are dear, and I mean, you just
Mhm.
you're pulling on my heartstrings right now. First of all, the point you make about the whiskey reaching an age where the people who are managing the barrel have continued to believe that it's going to keep getting better is such a fucking good point. It's unbelievable because I don't think that's fully appreciated. And as we've taken over the maturation process, so originally we were just buying what we needed for our first couple blends, but then of course we wanted to stockpile aged stock, and we wanted to start manipulating the flavors to give us more access, right? So we started doing some of our own recasking. And some of the projects we did where we take stuff that's like in ex bourbon, that's been in ex bourbon for a lot of time, and then we put it into a new barrel, put it into new wood. And what's amazing is you need to follow that whiskey because the second it tips, your only option ever is take it out of wood and stop the aging or risk whatever's going to happen next. And
Mhm.
if it tips past good and starts to get into over oaked, you can't wind the clock back. And so your point about the fact that this whiskey has continued to get better without ever being pulled off the rack is such a good one. That's such a good one.
Mhm.
And then the second point about maturation in different environment, but also I would add with different rules, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there are a lot of there's strict rules with bourbon, not only about the fact that it has to be in new wood, but the fill strength is a sneaky little thing that people don't think a lot about. If it's put in new oak at a much higher ABV, so above 62.5, it's much more stable. It matures at a much more even pace. And so the
Mhm.
Canadians who aren't hamstrung by this rule that everything has to be filled at 62.5 or below, um, we're seeing stuff that's been put in at 73%. And it just the the wood soluble compound the alcohol soluble wood compounds that you're getting in there, they're happening much slower and a much more even rate. So it's not just the temperature, and it's not just the hey, we can put it in used wood and not get it over extracted. It's even more rules about fill strength and things like that that give them the ability to age for a longer time without getting that gnawing on a dining room table that you're talking about, which by the way is my least favorite thing about American whiskey. To be
Mhm.
completely upfront, like I, it drives me nuts that when I drink an old bourbon that probably costs whoever is pouring it for me because I don't have access like a lot of consumers do. Um, it drives me nuts that I'm like the first 80% of this whiskey is so damn good, and the last
Mhm.
20% is that like bitter acid coming back up into the and just creeping into the sides of my palate, and I'm just like, man, this is such a bummer. It's such a bummer that we can't get this. And Canadian just blew that door open for us. And we were like,
Mhm.
holy cow, these are some of our favorite bourbon flavors, some of our favorite American rye flavors, but we're not paying the price on the finish.
Mhm. Well, it's like to me, it's the difference, and there's so many things to talk about here, but it's the difference between espresso and pour over, right? Uh,
Yes.
Bourbon is very much like espresso, where you're mashing it in and pulling it back out, and you're trying to extract a whole lot in a short amount of time. Whereas some of these Canadians are allowed to be pour over, where it sort of steeps with itself and it slowly extracts some of those flavors, so you don't get as much astringency or bitterness. In kind of the case in point of this last week, once you work for a place and then they find out you're the whiskey guy, and then you're always the whiskey guy, and you get to do you're going to do a tasting. I want you to do a tasting for our people, and so I did one last week, and the final product was a 15-year age stated product from Sazerac, and you can make the assumptions on what it is, but everything else was 4 to 6 years old. I had 3 bottles that were 4 to 6 years old. One was a small batch, one was a bottled and bond, one was a single barrel, and then we did 107 proof, 15-year-old product from the same place. The greatest majority of the people there, and some of them are just whiskey geeks, blindly pick the bottled and bond. 4 to 6 year old 100 proof whiskey is where most people really, really like to be until you reveal the bottle, right?
Yeah.
And the age statement is really not what you're chasing. You're chasing the cloud of the bottle. You're chasing whatever it is. And as soon as you pull it out with that, side profile of that man's face with a 15-year age statement, then everybody's like, "Oh, come on, you got me on that one." And no, I didn't get you. This has been the truth all along. Your own bias comes into play. But you touched on some legal nuance of Canadian whiskey that's different than what happens here in the United States. And it's not just that proofing, right? But it is, you have a grain ratio versus a mash bill. So give me
Yes.
the lowdown on that a little bit, which I know,
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
want you
yeah.
to explain it, and then we'll talk about
Yes.
that for a second.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's one of the yeah, it's very funny because when we'll release whiskey, and on the label it'll say grain. I don't think the word grain ratio fit in there, otherwise we would have said grain ratio. But basically, we're talking about the grain ratio as opposed to the mash bill. So obviously, with American whiskey, you have something like a mash bill will be 70% corn, 25% rye, 5% malted barley. And what that measurement is the weight of the grain. That's what the mash bill is. But it doesn't actually take into account alcohol yield.
Mhm.
So when you make a Canadian whiskey and you do the individual beers, right? So you're doing 100% corn and you make a beer from the corn before you distill it. They get it up to like 16% alcohol by volume. With the rye, if they're really efficient, they'll get it up to 8%, maybe 9%, but usually like in the 7 range, which basically means the same amount of grain is actually producing half as much alcohol when you look at corn versus rye. So what that means for bourbon is when you have a bottle of bourbon that's 70% corn or 75% corn, it's the alcohol by volume in there that's represented is actually way more tipped towards the corn. It's probably closer to 85%, something in that
Mhm.
range. So when we make our whiskey and we have something that says like 87% corn, 12% rye, 1% malted barley, which we've done several times, we've had people come back to us and say, "Hey, wow, the rye is really coming through much more than I would think with the mash bill." And that's because, look, if we used weight of grain to produce our 87% corn, 12% rye, 1% malted barley, uh, it would take it would take a mash bill of like 70, 25, 5.
Mhm.
So effectively, when we do grain ratio, we're talking about the liquid in the bottle as opposed to the weight of grain that was used to make that ratio. That was not my most efficient way of describing it, but I did my best. I
No,
felt
no,
pretty good.
it's perfect because this is the point that it brings for me, right? Is that there's a lot of different styles of rye that exist in the North American marketplace. 95.5 from MGP is really, really standard, but there's this phrase that's used, a Kentucky rye, right? And a Kentucky rye in Kentucky is usually 51% rye, 49% corn. But when you couch it under what you're saying effectively, right? If you were to look at the actual grain, that's a bourbon, right? Because you're going to have the bulk of the
Perfect.
alcohol as a bourbon.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is why people like in Kentucky that are bourbon fans really like Kentucky rye, because the flavor profile is bourbon,
Yes.
right? It's just a high rye bourbon at this point because of that. And that was so as I was digging through and I kind of, listened to your explanation of this on past ones, it flipped a switch in my brain that just made immediate sense, right? And you're not going to get there with your 95.5, where it's going to be more, the corn is more stated than just the 5%, but not
Yep.
that much, right? But on these really high corn content mash bills for rye, after it's
You're,
all said and
yeah,
done, you're drinking bourbon.
and it's funny. So it's it's very apt that you bring it up because for us, when we started, um, we thought there would be a much greater demand for rye dominant whiskey from Canada.
Mhm.
And the reason behind that was simple. There are a lot of age stated ryes that are older ryes in the US market that are labeled as US products, but really they're sourced from Canada. And so, and frankly, the consumers who are spending $100+ on a bottle of whiskey, a lot of them know this. Most of them know this.
Mhm.
So when we came up with Found North, and when we came up with the name Found North, a big piece of that was literally being as obvious as we could and just saying, "Hey, this is from Canada. We found this. We sourced
Right.
this north, right?" Um, but the interesting thing was what we discovered was people, the general whiskey drinking public, and yeah, so the general whiskey drinking public, um, they like the concept of rye more than they actually like the flavor. Um,
Mhm.
rye has a really fun Rye is fun and Mad Men and the cowboy feel of it. It's spicy and it's awesome and it seems great. Um, and then people drink it, and what they really want is for it to taste like bourbon. And
Mhm.
and so what happened to us when we made batch one and batch two was we made batch one as a rye. We were intending to make batch two also as a rye, but as we were
Mhm.
making it and we were tweaking the ratios, it just got so much better from a flavor standpoint for us. The more we increased the corn, we literally ended up at 80% corn, 20% rye, and we thought to ourselves, "There's no way anybody's going to want this. Everybody's going to just go right to our rye. We're going to sell out the rye. We're going to be sitting on this batch two forever." And then, of course, there's 15 times as many bottles of bourbon sold in the US as rye every year, right? And then
Mhm.
on top of it, to your point, most of those Kentucky ryes are pretty damn corn dominant from a flavor
Mhm.
standpoint. So even a lot of the stuff that is rye is really much more of a bourbon profile. So should we be shocked that when we made batch one and batch two was much more of a crowd pleaser. And
Mhm.
now, of course, this is effectively most of what we make. And to even take that a step further, when we made single barrels of rye, by far the most popular single barrels of rye we made were ryes that we put into New American Oak, and they picked up so much of the marshmallowy caramel bourbon feel to them, and people thought they were bourbons. People drank them and thought they were bourbons and loved them. And so, we learned, you as I said at the beginning, you come into this with kind of an idea, but then of course you respond to what people like and what they're willing to drink and what they're willing to try. And that was one of the biggest lessons we learned was the concept of rye is much more exciting than the flavor is pleasing to our market.
Yeah, and I think that'll change, right? I think that's starting to change a little bit, because there's a whole lot of people that have I don't like rye, right? And now they're getting interested because some of the big boys are starting to make rye in a meaningful fashion. It's like, oh, I
Yes.
should pay attention to this, um, but they've always believed they didn't like it, and then they approach rye with a bourbon palate, right? And so if you're thinking about it from a bourbon construct, an American whiskey construct, even it's the wrong place to be. Like you have to view this. This is an entirely different spirit. It may have some of the similar rules in some places where mash bills and entry proofs and all of these things, but it's a different flavor profile, completely different flavor profile. And so as um as the cocktail world developed more rye cocktails and people
Mm.
started buying more of those, we're seeing how it plays in those cocktails, and then people start getting more interested. So I think we're on the edge of that, and I'm saying that to encourage. I think at some point in time, y'all need to revisit rye, like because I think
Oh,
it's going to be there. But
don't worry.
oh, don't worry. So
Oh
that's
yeah.
one of the questions. Are we going back to rye eventually? Because you did, when you dig around some of the early press and early things that you guys, we want to be a rye company. We want to be a rye
Yeah.
company. And then
Yes.
there's this shift, right? And so I charted out all the grain bills of all the batches and kind of looking over this, and you see this striation towards corn, which is going to be super popular, especially with these age statements and these flavor profiles that exist, and um, being softer than what people thought it was probably going to be with a significant age statement, because
Yep.
it's not bourbon, but they don't. We're all looking at all the whiskey geeks in North
Right.
America are approaching it from either Scotch or from bourbon, and it's neither of those things. It's
Yes.
probably somewhere between those two, maybe, but it's not.
Yeah, yeah. I think about that. I think about that sometimes, particularly with and we'll get into this when we get to Peregrine, because Peregrine's moved further away from bourbon than the batches. Um,
Hmm.
and I think for people who dabble in both bourbon and Scotch, it's going to be like, oh my God. But it's not Scotch, and it really
Hmm.
isn't. And so it's funny you bring that up. But to your point about the profile and what people are willing to explore, um, that's so true. And I think it's happened. Um, I think it's definitely happened with rye. I think it's happening with rye. And I will say, I had a I had our friends over at the Chill Filter podcast who you talked to.
Hmm.
Brian sent me just a sample of the Wilderness Trail 7 year rye, cast strength rye,
Hmm.
and I had it. I liked it when I had it, but I had it again 2 nights ago. I just went back to it, and there are flavors in it that are so good, and they're not
Hmm.
bourbon. And I was just curious. I was like, this is exciting. This is really
Hmm.
exciting. I had that feeling of like, yes, I want more companies to do this and to push people into this range, because it had that minty freshness mixed with a kind of a dessert sweetness without the really overbearing syrupiness that you get
Hmm.
from corn. And I was like, this is fucking brilliant. I was like, this whiskey is brilliant, and I hope people like it as much as I do, because there are a lot of companies that are opening doors for Found North to explore more of the edges of the flavor map. And frankly, like I went back to batch two last night. I was tasting it before a live stream, and I was just doing it to see the evolution of what our corn dominant
Hmm.
whiskeys have done. And batch two is by far the most bourbony whiskey we've ever made. And it was great for us because when we entered in, you know, one of the main ways that people try Found North is they have somebody who has a bottle and says, "I'm not going to tell you what this is. I'm going to pour it for you, and you're going to like
Right.
it." And then they get to be like, "Ha ha, it's Canadian." And that's like so much of our growth is like, "Ha ha, gotcha."
Yeah.
Um, so it's interesting that with Found North, we've actually had the freedom, as people have gotten to know us a little bit and we've built a little trust with consumers, we've had the freedom to start stretching our profile a little bit more. And nothing is more exciting than that. Honest to God,
Hmm.
I'm so jacked up about that. I'm so excited about that. And I think it's definitely a testament to a lot of trailblazing companies that have been pushing different flavors and different techniques. But honestly, it's also credit to the consumer, who's become way more open-minded.
Hmm.
I don't know how Found North would have done 5 or 6 years ago. I certainly know 10 years ago, when I was working in retail, that it would have struggled. There were way more people 10 years ago who were like, if it's not, if it's not bourbon, I don't want it. And then there's another subcategory that was like, if it's not Kentucky bourbon, I don't
Right.
want it. And then there's a subcategory that was like, fuck you, I only drink bibs. And it's like, all right,
Exactly.
that 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 like, and the
Or a
same with,
heritage brand, right? Like I only
yeah, yeah,
drink a heritage brand bottled in Bond,
yeah.
Kentucky. Like
Yeah,
that's what
yeah,
it's
right.
gonna
It's
all
like,
be.
how narrow can we get?
Hmm.
And the same, by the way, was true with single malt scotch. I had so many scotch people who I'd be like, "Hey, I've got the best bourbon producer coming in for a seminar," and they'd be like, "Yeah, I'm not interested. I only drink single malt." And I'm like, "All right." Now there's still holdouts, right? And there's still plenty of
Yep.
people who don't drink Found North only because it's Canadian, and that's fine. And we'll we'll live. But what's really exciting is the number of people who are willing to go out on a limb on a $150 product that's from Canada. I just don't know that existed 5, 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and it is a testament to the consumer, you know. And you mentioned that about Wilderness Trail and their rye, and you're exactly right. And I'm really hoping that Campari doesn't strangle the life out of Wilderness Trail and take away that innovative spirit. But I think we're benefiting from so you identify these people that are originally like, I'm only going to drink heritage brands and bottled and bond, and this is maybe 15 years ago. The bourbon boom creates a situation where sometimes you can't get those things, and so now all of these other brands kind of dovetail into the marketplace, and it's like, well, I can't get this, so I'll try something new. I can't get the thing that I've always bought. I mean, 5 years ago there was a period where you couldn't find Buffalo Trace, just standard Buffalo Trace, on a shelf anywhere,
Yeah,
right? And when that's your
crazy.
shelf standard, it makes sense that you're going to explore. And I go back and look, and you said batch two is the most bourbony one that you have, and it's finished in X wheated bourbon barrels, right? So that makes a ton of sense, right? Because there's no Speyside or tequila or Hungarian or any of these other things that you guys have done, which I also want to talk about. But like, it's a high corn mash bill in an X wheated bourbon barrel. Yeah, that sounds exactly like
Gotta
what
do it.
would capture everyone's interest in it. And it's interesting to see the first thing that you push out is a rye with a unique flavor profile likely to most consumers, and the second one is a bourbon. And so now you've covered a broad swath of consumers, and you follow that with a rye, and then you follow it with another like bourbon but you're throwing in some tweaks with Hungarian
Yep.
oak and Speyside and Rechar American oak, which are going to tweak these flavor profiles. And I will posit that smaller brands like you guys, even NDPs and people that are distilling, because you're on a small scale, you can toy with some of these flavors, and you
Yep.
guys are the ones that are really responsible for expanding the palate. The reason they're there tasting is because they bought themselves out of standard fare, but there's this big broad range of flavors that are out there, and so you guys are like little mad scientists, like putting these flavor profiles out, and they go taste it like, this is unlike anything I've had before. I really, really like this because I've never had something that was aged in Hungarian oak, right? Because all I ever drank was heritage bottled bond American
Totally.
bourbon. That's it.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think you guys, you deserve some of this credit, right? You and the segment that you represent deserve some of this credit, and the expansion of the palate that leads to more rye adoption in my mindset.
Yeah, and I think the you make a really good point just about accessibility. I also think if you look at back in 2000, there were 50, as in 50
Hmm.
distilleries making bourbon in the United States. By like 2014, 2015, I think it was something like 1,800 distilleries
Hmm.
in the US were making bourbon. Now, granted, most of the liquid was still being sourced at that time, and
Right.
a lot of it from MGP. Um, but as a result, if you really think if you think about like the necessity for product differentiation from those NDPs, they had to do something. It's like, hey, if all this is sourced from here, and there are
Hmm.
7 other guys who are doing this, and it's all sourced from here, why are you going to buy brand one versus brand two? And almost out of necessity, a lot of these brands started going, well, it's going to be one of two things. We're either going to do interesting finishes and start doing, bourbon finished in this or whatever they want to designate it, or we're going to do blending, right? And you
Hmm.
saw companies like High West coming out and saying, "Hey, here's Rendezvous Rye. It's 16-year-old rye blended with 6-year-old rye, and this is that's why it's different." And Double Rye is 6-year with 2-year, and this is why it's different, and this is what it does. And that was early on when High West was doing that, people were like, and
Right.
now it's you have thought leaders like Barrel who are coming out. Here's our it's got 5, 6, 7. It's got 8 from Tennessee. It's got 15 from here, and this and that.
Hmm.
Um, and so the the consumer not only could not buy the heritage brands, but all the other brands were trying to find their own feet and their own differentiation through blending and maturation, which really actually opened the door for us to come in and go, hey, blending and maturation is great. Why don't we use the spirit that's been distilled and designed for this?
For that.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, for exactly this purpose. Y'all just need to wrap your head around the fact that it's from Canada, and so that was that's been the big hurdle, but it's also the boon of the brand, right? It's also our bread and butter is we get to do this, and we get to do it with spirit that was made for that process.
Yeah, there's this very unique vein of distaste for Canadian things, and I've not fully understood it. While I completely still use this, right? So one of my peers at work, he lives in Canada, works remotely in Canada, and so we regularly will spar because the United States is obviously better, and so screw Canada, right? Like that's the way you're supposed to be. But
Right.
at the end of the day, that there's a lot of opportunity, and you identified it right, that this product is specifically made for blending, and blending in the United States has had this negative connotation for a very long time, right? And I think we're getting past that time where people are like, oh, blending is just a way to hide something bad, right? It is
Yeah.
a thing that comes out, and so people still shy away from this is a blended whiskey, right? Because they don't want to say that phrase. And um, you're right. Barrel has been a great company to kind of push that direction. I mean, their 2024 New Year blend has 8 different states worth of distilleries in it, right? And that's one of the most significant I've seen in a while. But it is flavor differentiation, right? When everybody's
Yes.
getting some of the same whiskey, it's like walking into the paint department and you go look in the section where all the whites are, like all of the white paint. It's like, what's the difference between this white and that white and that? Like they're all the same, even though they're just slightly tweaked.
Yeah.
So you have to do something, and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to make red paint, and you stick it right in the middle, and people are like, holy shit, I want to buy the red paint because it's not everything else that's
It's not
here,
all
and
white.
it's appreciated, at least from a consumer standpoint, that we're having this opportunity. But so I'm a real hard left turn, right? So you started off in the industry buying whiskey for retailers at a wholesale level, or whatever it happens to
No,
be.
that's yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
As a
you
retailer,
you
yeah.
depart. I assume you depart college. I mean, you said you went to Davidson. You depart college, and did you like, I want to go work in the spirits industry, or it was like this job was available and seemed interesting?
No, yeah, actually, I departed college and I immediately said I want to go work with my brother. And I moved to California, and he and I did a startup for about 2 years. Um, and honestly, we got our ass kicked. It was tough. It was a tough world, and we were young.
Hmm.
And and it was interesting because I did that with Zach, and and we kind of we got to a dead end, and we were like, hey, we got debt, we got bills to pay, we got things we need to do here, we need to go get jobs and part ways from each other. And I remember both of us kind of having this conversation of like, hey, if we get a shot again to do this again, we're going to circle back and give this a second run, because we loved working together, we really did. And we're very he and I are very, very close. We always have been. And so I was looking for a new gig, and I was moving. I knew I was moving from California, and I called a friend and I said, "Hey, you got to come out. I'm moving back to the East Coast. You got to come out and see me once. You've been out here in California. We haven't crossed paths. Like, let's do this once before I go back." And so he came with his now wife, his fiance at the time, and she saw my whiskey collection. And I started drinking whiskey in college. I like drinking whiskey for a couple of reasons. One, I didn't like the feeling of drinking a lot of cheap beer. Um, and at the ABC stores in North Carolina, I could get a handle of Maker's Mark pretty cheap.
Yep.
Pretty efficient. Um, and so I liked the feeling of it better. But let's be honest, I also thought I was cool. It's like I'm drinking whiskey, I'm the sophisticated, everybody else. Now I was
Absolutely.
probably mixing it with Coke. I was still a 21-year-old doofus, but I had started to drink whiskey, and when I moved to California, I'd started to get really interested in single malt. And so she comes in and she sees I got like, I think it was like 6 single malt. It wasn't a big collection, but
Mhm.
I had like 6 different single malts on the shelf. And she turned to my buddy Pete and she said, "Pete, do you think he could fake his way through a Scotch tasting?" And he's like, "Oh my goodness, that's a good idea." And they're having this conversation back and forth. I'm like, "Hey, hello, hi, what's
I'm
going
not.
on? What are
I'm
you
still
talking
here.
about?" Yeah, I'm still here. And she proposed this idea to me. She said, "Hey, look, I work for a commercial real estate firm. We're opening a new office building, and the CEO wants to have a Scotch tasting instead of a wine tasting. And for the life of me, I can't find a Scotch expert who can do it. Do you think you could pull it off?" And I was like, "Oh man, I'm looking for a new job. Like, I don't know what."
Hmm.
And she goes, "You need to buy 4 bottles of scotch and that's it. And I'll fly you out here and my budget's 10 grand. So there's going to be a lot left over to pay you."
Yeah, done.
And I was like, "Done. When is it?"
I'm
"Done.
there
I'm
tomorrow.
in." Yeah, I was like, and they're like, "Okay, it's 2 months from now." So I
Mhm.
legitimately bought um I bought like 30 books on scotch. I mean, I bought everything I could find and I just buried myself in it, picked the scotches out, bought them, um, and went and did this tasting, and I had so much fun. Holy moly, did I have so much fun! I liked everything about it, and I was like, "This is the next. This is the space I want to work in. This is the space I want to work in." And that fall, I saw my a good friend of my dad's, and I was talking to him about it, and he was like, "Dude, get your head out of your ass, get on a plane and go to Scotland. You want to work in Scotch? Go to Scotland." And I was like, "And do what? What am I gonna do?" Like, and he was like, "Just go. The opportunities will present itself. But if you want to be in this business, go." And so I bought a ticket. I bought a ticket for October 1st with a flight home on November 1st. I didn't book a hotel. I landed at like 7 p.m. without a hotel, without a schedule, without an itinerary. I ended up going to 40 distilleries in 30 days, and I just the whole time I pretended I was a whiskey writer.
Mhm.
I was like, "Hey, I'm writing this blog, and I'm just trying to learn about the process." And I got a total like 1 month crazy crash course in how whiskey's made, how it's marketed, how it's sold, and how it tastes. And so when I came back to the US, I went to a great retailer in Boston called Gordon's, and I met with Ricky and Ken Gordon, and I said, "Hey, I've just done this Scotch pilgrimage. I want to sell Scotch. I think there's a market here." And they hired me to move boxes and sell Scotch. When
Mhm.
somebody would come up and say, "Hey, I'm looking for a Scotch," they would call me up and say, "Hey, Nick, can you talk to this person?" And literally from there, it all just I started doing classes and I started getting really into other categories of whiskey. Barrel picking was a big thing. We started going down to Kentucky and doing that. And by 2016, I called my brother and I was like, "There's a business here, and there's an opportunity to sell whiskey, and I want to take a crack at it with you." And he quit his job, moved back to Boston, and we launched as a brand ambassador and brokerage firm. Eventually got our import license and eventually started Found North. But it was kind of a crazy ass journey, to be honest.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the kind of story that you expect from passionate people, right? And this is the thing that I've always come across. It doesn't matter what the industry is. When you find someone who is working in the thing that's passionate, very often there is some just super crazy ass story that led to them being where they are, right? Because you've got people that will work a job because it pays for the things that they enjoy to do, and then there's people that are like you that are like, I want my pay to come from the thing that I'm also really, really enjoying. And sometimes that requires creating it on your own. And you've done this with your brother. So like working with your family, it goes one of two ways, right? And
Yes.
so how did you know, like from the startup to the whiskey thing, like how do you have this like assurance that like this business relationship is not going to destroy the relationship with my brother?
Yeah, that was the benefit that we gained from doing the first startup. Because when you're trying to do something and you're getting your teeth kicked in, that's when things can really go sour from a relationship standpoint. And it was tough. We kind of we battled with each other at times, and there were plenty of struggles. It was also hard because my brother is 4 years older than me, and was a pretty like before he went on the first crack at doing a startup with me, had been quite professionally successful. And I was fresh out of college and didn't know what the fuck I was doing, and so there was a lot of him dragging me along,
Hmm.
um, and teaching me. And it was hard for him to be so far ahead of me professionally, and trying to make a living, and trying to and that dynamic was really challenging. And so I think what was so critical for us in um, when we went at it the second time with whiskey was I had spent several years becoming a whiskey expert, or as best I could at the time. And um, and I had built up a pretty good understanding of the industry, and of the customers. And so when he came across the country, and we went after it the second time, we were on a much more even playing field. Yes, he had still been like a professional entrepreneur and successful at it, but at least now I was bringing a different thing and a different level of expertise to the table, where it wasn't this big brother little brother dynamic anymore. It was very
Hmm.
much this, hey, we're on an even playing field. We're both bringing everything we can to this. um, and I think that dynamic shift was really key in us being able to work together successfully. um, but you know what, the credit in this circumstance, I think so much of it goes to my brother. um, and and he was I literally I remember, like my fondest memory of my brother was, we were traveling together. We were actually sitting on top of a Jeep, on a family vacation, and it was like we were sitting under literally under like a field of stars. And my brother, he was 18, I was 14. When you're 14, your brother is like
Hmm.
God.
Yep.
And he put his arm around me, and we were looking out, and he's like, buddy, we're we're gonna do something really great together as we grow up. And he said that to me, and I was like, my hair stands up now just thinking about
Hmm.
it. And so I think for us, there's been this incredible trust that is really, that's, to your point, when it goes right. I think that's one of the reasons that the working with your family thing can go right, is is rooted in, like, I never he and I know that neither of us will ever screw each other over. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, and that's, we always want the best for the business, because we've wanted the best for each other for as long as we've been alive. And like, we think of each other as our best friends, and that's why we can work together. That's definitely why we can work. We also are good at talking to each other about difficult shit,
Hmm.
which is underrated. We're very good at, like, working hard stuff out together. So yeah.
That's see, and this is what makes, at least for me, whiskey such an interesting segment, because it's relational, it's romantic, it's ingrained in community, right? Like vodka's just a thing, right? And to some degree, a lot of other spirits are just a thing that you use to do something else. But there's this, we poke fun at the some of the heritage brands with some of the long term legacy stories that they tell, but you just told me the foundation of the story that becomes the legacy if Found North is still existing in 30 years, right?
Yep.
And it's true, right? And so that's what makes it attractive to the consumer, because as we develop as consumers, we want to know more about where our stuff comes from and why it comes from that, right? Like we're seeing that in food now. We've seen it in clothes in the past. We see it in vehicles, but whiskey is really kind of hitting that. Like we want to know the source. We want to know the sustainability things, right? But we also
Yes.
want to know like it's coming from real people with real stories with real things, and that's what your brand does specifically, right? It doesn't have that long story, but it has the current story, which to many could be more compelling than the old story, right? Because it's verifiable right now. But if
Yeah.
we were to talk
Yes.
about it 100 years
Yeah.
from
Yeah. Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
it's on the
So
back of somebody's
right.
diary that we dug up in an archive, right?
Yeah, it's like reading the I love the romantic story behind the founding of Four Roses, like the
Yeah.
bringing the roses to I absolutely love that story. I hope it's 100% true. But you said, I mean, when people start talking about it, they're like, well, no, actually, there's some other brand, it's like, okay.
It
No,
it is, and there's the person that wants to ruin it for everybody. But
yes.
what I like is I like in every let's just say the story's fabricated, but in every pound of lie, there's an ounce of truth, and that's what makes it believable and what's make it
Yeah, yeah,
lovable. And it's not
yeah.
harmful, right? That story doesn't harm us as a consumer. It gives us a connection point with it, right?
Yes.
If there was someone being harmed by that story not being true, and there's somebody else that deserves, you know,
The credit
there
or
are some
whatever it is.
brands that
Yeah. Yeah,
need to
yeah, yeah.
give some recognition to other people, right, for their success, and they are in some form or fashion. Nobody's being harmed by it. I I love it. It's what makes it super fun. That's why that's why I have this name, embellish, right? Because you embellish
I
a
was gonna
story a
ask you
little bit,
about that.
right?
Yeah.
The story of me and my family doing something develops over time, right? We go to Disney, we have a great time. 20 years from now, that story of when we went to Disney is going to be a little bit tweaked, and it's going to be more
Yeah, yeah.
suited for storytelling. The heart of it is still true, but the story is
She's migrated a little bit from the from the original.
that's what
Yeah,
happens,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
that's what happened with any truth, right?
yeah.
If you want to know what the truth is, there's like three versions of
Oh
it.
man.
There's like your version of the truth, my version of the truth, and then the real one is somewhere between these two things,
All
right?
right, so
That's
you and I see whiskey like really on the same plane. Because I love the connectivity aspect of whiskey, and it's funny when I really you're talking about doing the blind tasting with 4 to 6, and then with the Monsieur Van Winkle,
right.
and you know I love that. I love doing stuff like that. I think it's really fun. But I actually also like um, one thing that you'll hear me say all the time is like context matters.
Hmm.
And I actually really care about the context, and I think other people should care. I think whiskey drinkers should care about the context. Um, I remember one of my favorite tastings. I had a um, I basically it's a long story, but I got access to a bunch of these uh, McPhail's collection minis that were 50 years old.
Hmm.
And they had been distilled in 1937 and bottled in 1987, and we were pouring them in 2015. Um, and the whiskey was fabulous. The whiskey actually was good. A lot of times you drink
Hmm.
that 50-year-old style, you get access to these crazy things and you're like, cool, this is really awesome, but it's terrible liquid, right? This
Right.
liquid was actually really, really, it was quite good. But I did the whole tasting, the presentation I did, which I thought was clever, so I'll pat myself on the back. But the presentation I did was I just started by talking about all these different things that had been invented and created in 1937, and then all these
Hmm.
things that had been invented and created in 1987, and then all these things that had been invented and created. And I basically said to the audience, I said, look, we're all about to pour and drink 50-year-old scotch, and that's amazing. Um, but like, just appreciate how crazy it is that a bunch of people laid this down 75 years ago, and we get
Yep.
to drink it now. And they put their lives into this stuff. It's like if you drink a 50-year-old whiskey and you don't appreciate that it was stewarded by multiple generations who are all dead, like you're kind of missing out on a little bit of the soul. And if it tastes a little better to you because of that, that's not a crime. You're not being
No,
duped. You're appreciating it.
you, you're right. Right. Environment is important, and it always is, and that's why it does taste different. And I'll continue. Right. So we unveil, and everybody's sort of surprised by it.
Oh
But
yeah,
then
yeah.
there's this moment that happens afterwards where there's these people that this is the first time they're whiskey aficionados. They enjoy it, but this is the first time they've ever had access to that particular beverage, and so it becomes
Yep.
a sentimental moment. They may not have picked it as their favorite, but they're never gonna forget the time that they
Yeah.
got to try it, and not in a bad way because I tricked them or fooled them. Because
No,
there's
for sure.
still this moment of revelry of tasting this thing, and I'll challenge you. you mentioned Cole from Chill Filtered, the other
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
podcast. Uh, Go back to an episode I guest hosted for them while Cole was out because his child was born, and they always do a bottle, right? And I sent some whiskey specifically, and it's 1969 Jim Beam decanter, right, which is 10
Woo.
years old, which means it was put in the bottle in 1959. But I didn't tell him what it was. I just told him because it's a decanter bottle, and it was one that Van Gogh had done. And it's called the Zouave. It's a specific painting. So we talked about the Zouave and the story behind that particular painting and where it was done or whatever as he's tasting it, as his co-host is tasting it. That becomes special, even if the whiskey isn't great. It was good, and it's 100 proof Jim Beam from 1969. It's good, but is it fantastic? Maybe not without the story, right? Without the whole like, and the fact that this sits on a shelf somewhere untouched until I purchased it a year ago, right? Like,
Yeah.
no one. It happened to sneak by this person, or it sat on a collector shelf, and they always thought about opening. Like, there's this. This is what makes whiskey romantic, is that there is time involved in it, right? There's significant time. There's people's lives. There's this touch to the soil, even, right? Because
Yes.
it's a product. And I had Mark from Waterford, right? Waterford Irish whiskey
Yeah.
on earlier this week, and he was talking about he puts on his products that it is produce, right? Because whiskey is produce.
Mm,
It's
mm,
just
mm.
produce at a different stage in its life cycle. It's not a product. Like, this mouse is a product. This is produce. This is from the earth. And so now you get like even more romanticism in it. And this is the entire reason why I just have this podcast, because it's fun. It's interesting. We can take it as seriously as we want to, or as light as we want to, but
Yep.
there's something, you don't want to use the term, but like it's a spirit in the truest of sense. There's a
Yes.
spirit to
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Just the origin of the word whiskey. I think it's totally corny, but whiskey, for those who don't know, whiskey is just the anglicized version of uskeba, right? Which is just the
Mhm.
Gaelic for water of life. It's just the translation from aquavit to uskeba, and it just got shortened eventually to whiskey. It is totally it's totally a little corny, and I love it. I love it, and I think you nailed on my favorite part of whiskey, and um I had this conversation with a collector years ago, and it always ate at me a little bit, because he's an incredible collector, buyer and seller of American whiskey, and he has in his collection the most absurd. I mean, just the most
Mhm.
of absurd bottles you could imagine. Like everyone's white whale is in this guy's collection. Um, and so I had to ask him. We're sitting there, we're trying something, and I said, you know, okay, you have all these bottles. What's the bottle that you've put away, the super rare one that you're gonna open, you know, first kid's
Mhm.
21st birthday, whatever the celebration is. And he looked at me totally aghast and he was like, I'm never opening these. He was like, I'm never opening these. And I was like, what? And he goes, look, you don't understand why I have these. If you have the Mickey Mantle rookie card, you don't take it out of the packaging. And I remember like being like, okay, but I've thought about that comment for
Yeah.
like 8 years now. And the thing is, like, that's true, but you can enjoy the Mickey Mantle rookie card looking through the case at it. You can't fucking enjoy the 1939 Stitzel Weller that you've had tucked away by just
Mhm.
staring at it. You have to actually drink it to enjoy the artistry of the liquid. And
Mhm.
once you do, it's gone. And I think that matches in a for me it has always matched how I feel about life. Like life is this ephemeral thing that that you get to savor once. And that's what I love about great whiskeys is you if you collect something like I collect to drink. I don't collect
Mhm.
to have the Mickey Mantle rookie card. I collect, and the only reason I collect is because there's a bottle that I say I'm going to open this and pour this when I feel like it matches the
The right
moment
thing.
and the ephemerality, right? I want to match
Mhm.
the ephemerality to the ephemerality. And I've opened all of my favorite whiskeys that I've ever had on my best friend's weddings, my own
Yeah.
bachelor party, cracking open an old Stitzy, like just the bottles I put away. They're not there because I want to stare at them and I want to have them. They're there because I just want to match that one moment in time with the right moment for opening and finishing a bottle that'll never be made again, right? Like that's
Yep.
the parallel that just gets me going.
It's an irreplaceable moment, and you're trying to find the appropriate stage for the right star, right? Like
Yes.
this person this is made for this moment, and I've run into collectors like that on a lot of different things, and I'm in the place where no I do if I got to wear a glove, I don't care. I want to hold the Mickey Man. I want to feel the weight of it in my hand. I
Yeah,
want to know what it is like, because when the person who made the card, they didn't know that it was going to be worth potentially millions later on in life,
right.
right? They made it because it was their job, because they took the job to pay the bills for their family, to do whatever, right? That was the moment in time. And holding it inside of a glass case forever limits some degree of that appreciation. And you're exactly right. Like, you can't enjoy the whiskey without opening. You can enjoy it, you can understand it, but also for a lot of these collectors, that's Schrodinger's whiskey, right? Like, it is both the best and worst whiskey you've ever had, but you're in a state of unknowing, and sometimes unknowing is more comfortable than knowing, right?
Right.
Because if you open it and it's bad, you spent thousands, you've been storing this, you've built this moment of hype, and it ends up tasting terrible. But if all you're after is the flavor and not the experience, then now it is a ruined moment. But even if it tastes terrible, so you've got this thing that you're opening up on your bachelor party, you're going to carry them, even if it's awful, you're going to carry the memory when we open this thing that I bought that was irreplaceable, and it was terrible, but we still drank it. And I remember the face that my best man made when he
Yeah,
took a
yeah.
shot of this stuff that tasted like lemon juice or whatever. Like, now it lives on in infamy, even though it wasn't good, right? It's this shared moment, right? And so that's what those people, I think, are missing out on. There's this wall full of, and everything I have is open, but there's this wall full of moments that you're missing now, right? And
Yeah.
you find the right audience and you open it with them, and you share it, and you move on, and you do the same thing with the next. And I absolutely love opening new bottles with people that are friends, and then whenever I leave, like, that's your bottle now. Like, I'm gonna go home, and you get to keep this because I've got the memory, you've got the whiskey and the memory, and that's perfectly
Right.
fine with
Right.
me. And it's also making more room for the next thing to replace it, so I can
I
keep
mean,
mine,
I love
right?
that.
Feed the
I love
habit.
that. Yeah, and I think I think that speaks a little bit to I've had this interesting feeling around some of our batches, particularly batch two. You can't find
Mhm.
batch two in a store anywhere. And we were a no name. Literally, we had no name. We were nobody when we made it. So we made 1,300 bottles of it. It's just like the smallest batch we've made. Um, and so it's effectively gone, and there are 5 cases in my basement, and I just think about, I'm like, holy moly, this is the you know I'm starting to have that feeling a little bit around some of our whiskey, and that was a little bit the point of the batches, was like, make whiskey that make whiskey that people are really excited, they're really excited to open. um
Mhm.
Savor that moment, remember the whiskey, move on and have another one of those moments. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't had a ton of inclination to try to recreate anything. We've iterated off of stuff, but there isn't we're not that drawn to, like, let's make a 10 year, and here's our 10 year, and it's going to taste the same over and over and over and over and
Mhm.
over again forever. That's just not on the docket anytime soon.
Well, and I'll say in support of that, I don't think that that's the right choice in whiskey today. Anyways, I think
Yeah.
the idea of batches and vintages are the only way. We're in a whiskey boom right now in the United States, and eventually the whiskey boom is going to stop. right? And so then what is your differentiation strategy post that? And if you've been making the same thing over and over and over again, if you have people that are entrenched and that is their whiskey, you'll be fine. You'll be
Right.
perfectly fine.
Right.
But how do you attract new consumers? And that's vintage. This is wine's been doing this for eons, right?
Yep.
It's a vintage. It's the 2012 Bordeaux is an amazing year, and everybody is going to kind of go after it. And so, what's 2013 like? I need to know what 2013 is like. Is it like 2012? If it's like that, then I'm even better. So you create this situation where people kind of going back to it, and you guys, I don't know that vintages are easy to do in whiskey as they are maybe in wine, because you have growing seasons and you have grapes and you have all of these different things, but you can build your vintages off of unique casks, right? And that's
Yep.
one thing I did note, right? In all of your batches, you range from Hungarian oak, Speyside, wheated, ex tequila, used American, rechar. Like there's a lot of this stuff that kind of comes into play, and I guess Spanish oaks, PX cherry, like all of the, what what whiskey, like what barrels are you actually like searching for barrels, or these are the things that kind of come to you, and like are there barrels that you're avoiding that you want to reuse? Like what is your barrel strategy, I guess, maybe?
Oh, it's a great question. Okay, yeah. So there's a difference between what we started with and where we're at now. In it just for just in our story. So I'll start with where we started, and um, you know, one of the one of the pieces of this that we um that I don't think is is always fully appreciated is like we had no financial backing when we launched this thing. Like, if you walk into a if you and I walked into MGP tomorrow with our hands in our pockets and said, "Hey, we'd like to buy 1 barrel," um, one of two things would
No,
happen. Most likely, we'd be shown the door. The number two thing that
actually, they'd
would
probably be like,
happen,
how did you get in here? Like
yeah, yeah,
how are you here?
yeah.
Like one barrel, who are you and how
What?
are you
Who
here?
are you? Right, right. But even if that number was 5 barrels, even if that number was whatever it was, when you are at the minimum threshold of what people want to take the time to actually sell, um, the only two things that can happen is one, you get rejected, or two, you get shown the 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 worst stuff.
Mhm.
Right. And and I think one question is like, well, how the hell did Found North walk in and buy old stuff that's interesting? And what happened in the way that we got our foothold into really quality liquid right off the bat was um, we bought a lot of experiments. So if you're big distillery X and you're the head blender or the master distiller or whatever, um, you still answer to someone, right? You still answer to a board, you still answer to a boss.
Yep.
So if you say like, hey, we love Hungarian oak. We're going to build a product around Hungarian oak. Um, no big deal. We're just going to buy 5,000 Hungarian oak casks. It's going to be a $10 million investment. And we think it's going to taste good, but we can't prove it to you now. Your boss is going to fire you, or your boss is just going to simply say, no, you can't do that.
Mhm.
So the way that these distilleries and this, I think that the heritage concept of whiskey, this is where it's actually really very real in my mind, is
Mhm.
a lot of the coolest whiskey projects are distiller or blender who's currently in charge says, I think this would work. Let's do it with 5 or 10 barrels. And that person lays that whiskey down, produced in a certain way. That person often retires, and their successor comes in and says, this worked. We're going to scale it up and do it. They do it, and then they do their own experiments, and then they retire. So a lot of times the life cycle of a project or a new development spans multiple generations of whiskey makers, which
Mhm.
means the whiskey makers, the romantic side of me wants to just pause and appreciate for a second here. Like the 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 whiskey makers know that their projects are going to outlive them. You know what I mean? And sometimes literally outlive them, which I think is like beautiful. And I got a story about that later on. But on the second level, I've told this story to my brother, and we were sitting there trying to figure out how we could get access to good whiskey because the first stuff we were shown everywhere we ever went was the lousy stuff. Um, and we were sitting around in on my back porch, and my brother said, "Hey, you always tell me about how this experimental process happens, blah blah blah." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And he goes, "What happens to those 5 barrels?" I thought to
No,
myself,
so yeah,
"Shit,
yeah,
what happens to those 5 barrels?"
right.
And it's a great question, because it's way too small amount of liquid for them to do anything with.
Mhm.
And so, we completely changed the tune of how we were approaching distilleries. We were approaching distilleries, and we were able to buy stuff below minimum buy for the distilleries we were working with, and we were able to get access to really quality stuff because we went in and we said, "Hey, what's the most interesting, delicious stuff that you need to get off your books because there's too little of it?" And that was how we ended up with the original Hungarian oak stuff we were working with, the
Mhm.
ex-wheated bourbon aged rye we were working with that we only had like 3 barrels of, the tequila stuff, the Speyside stuff. All of these interesting things that we originally bought were um, experiments that were excellent, that worked out well, that they couldn't use because there was too little volume, and we bought all of it. And so that was the original barrel strategy. Was not about the barrels themselves. It was just a means of getting access to much higher quality whiskey than we originally should have been able to have access, given our status as a non-entity with no fucking money. So that was the original barrel strategy. The barrel strategy now is actually quite different though, because now, yes, we go in and we say, "Hey, what you have something interesting that we know the right questions to ask," because sourcing is a needle in a haystack.
Mhm.
These distilleries that have millions of barrels, you know what I mean? Like they don't even know what the hell to show you if you don't know what to ask for. You can't just walk into these big guys and go, "Hi, can I have good whiskey, please?" They're like, like,
Right.
of course. So now what's happened is we've bought a lot of liquid that we're doing a lot of our own recasking with.
Mhm.
And our barrel strategy, our barrel strategy is much more, it's twofold. It's one about quality versus marketability. I don't give a rat's ass about Amburana if it doesn't work with the liquid and the quality of the wood isn't good, right? I we don't buy. I promise you, we do not buy a single barrel because we think it's sexy. I couldn't give a, I couldn't give two shits. I seriously, I don't care. Um, what I want is I want the distillate to match the wood.
Mhm.
And frankly, that's what Peregrine's all about. And I'll get to that in a second. But really, like, we spent so much time learning about whiskey as brand ambassadors, as buyers, as brokers, going to distilleries. I've been to, God, I must have been to 175 distilleries at this point, all over the world. I have tasted liquid where the biggest culprit in my mind are the Scots and sherry casks, because in Scotland you have single malt production, which requires pot stills, and that's where all the cool variation comes from. Is the size and the shape of the still dictates so much to the style of the
Mhm.
distillate. Fat squat stills, more butanol, heavier, oilier, juicier distillate. Light, tall, narrow still, like Glenmoe, you get a lighter style, you get more reflux, you get more of the high notes, the top notes. And from a barrel process, heavy big distillate does very well typically in Spanish oak sherry butts that are super porous and have a ton of both tannin and sugar. And what they need is a really fatty, heavy distillate that can handle that kind of wood maturation. Vice versa, if you are Glenmoe, Auchentoshan, Tom and Tool, any of these distilleries where tall, narrow distillation process, or triple distillation, or upward facing line arm, so you get way more reflux. Any of these different things that's designing the liquid to be lighter, they do much better in second fill ex bourbon. And it's not a sexy barrel. A second fill ex bourbon is not a super marketable barrel, but you know what it's going to do? Wonderful, wonderful things to your distillate. And so what you see a lot of that was a big turnoff for us was you see a lot of, wow, thank you, Macallan, Glendronach, Aberlour, sherry casks are sexy. So who gives a shit that we have distillate that's going to get its teeth kicked in by the sherry butt? We're going to put it in there so that we can say it's a sherry cask and we can sell it for more. And I hate that. I
Mhm.
absolutely hate that. I I I get why they do it, but that's when your marketing is driving your production instead of your marketing being a a big voice box for why your production makes good whiskey, which is what your marketing should be in my mind. So for
Mhm.
us, our barrel strategy now is when we're recasting component whiskeys, what we're trying to do is create flavor variation. We're basically looking at the distillate and saying what will do well, and then we're going straight to the source for wood, and we're going right to the barrel brokers, and literally we want to know what landed that day. We want to sample the barrel if it has any liquid remaining in it. We want to see it. We want to see that it's not rotting. We want to smell it and know that there's no mildew or mold. And then we're buying and filling that day, which I'll explain in a second. Actually, I'll explain it right now. Basically, when you buy wet casks, this drives me nuts. Oh man, you got me jacked up. So okay, when you buy wet casks, like the day that cask is dumped, you risk the deterioration of the quality of the wood. New oak and dechar rechar, that's not the case, right? If you strip the charcoal and you reheat the barrel, there's no liquid in there anymore. So you're not risking warping, you're not risking mildew, you're not risking the wood quality deteriorating. Same with new oak, right? You char a new oak barrel, it's got a lot of life cycle before it needs to be filled. Um, Wet cast is completely different. And a lot of the way that wet casts are rejuvenated defeats the purpose of them being wet casks. So what I mean by that is, like, if I buy a port pipe that's been shipped over and sat in a customs dock for 3 months, and then you take that barrel, what people do is they steam the barrel. They fill it up with water so that it reinflates, so that it gets its shape back. And in the process, they get rid of all of the port. So
Mhm.
then, like, what the hell is the point of it being a port cask unless you're really like hell bent on getting a particular wood species, which then you should be doing dechar rechar anyway.
Mhm.
So for wet casks, when we went to fill some casks earlier this year, we bought 48 casks and we had to reject 44 of them on shipment on delivery because the quality just was it had deteriorated so much. And we said, okay, screw this. This isn't what we're doing anymore. If we want wet casks, we want to have the distillate ready. It's at the warehouse, it's ready. Let's go to our barrel broker with a trailer. We'll wait for them to call us and say, hey, I've got a shipment of port, sherry, Malbec. I don't give a shit. Whatever it is, it's good quality. Come check it out. We will come, we check it out, we buy the wood that we want, we bring it right back, and we try to fill it that day. I'm not kidding.
Mhm.
And so for us, the Madeira cast that we used in batch 8, that was what that was. That was literally like, wow, this wood quality is really, really good. Let's put something in it. And we had a rye component that we really liked, that we thought would handle that kind of the fruit wine flavor that we were going to get from the Madeira, that nuttiness we were going to get from the Madeira, and we put rye in it, and it worked. And so for us, our cask buying strategy is very, very much about the quality of the wood and matching the distillate to the wood we're using. Um, what what that led us to is Peregrine. I don't know if you want to pause there before I talk a little bit about Peregrine, or if you want me to just keep rolling.
No, just keep going.
Okay, so this attitude that we have towards wood maturation is what got us going about Peregrine a long time ago, because we made Peregrine over the last year, but we've been thinking about it for a while. And what we thought about was like, okay, we love it when distilleries are very intentional about this wood species or this wood type is going to work with our distillate. And we like that we like brands that do that. But what's really cool about Canadian is we thought, well, what if we create the blend knowing what kind of wood types we have in mind? And so we're basically designing the starting point before it goes into that wood. So with
Mhm.
Peregrine, we made a blend and we very intentionally made it um, certain ways. And the biggest, there's a lot to it. We made it in a way that it was very clean. It didn't have any big holes that needed filling. That's a little way that we think about blends. Is like, I don't like bimodal whiskeys. I don't like whiskey that presents one flavor, has an empty spot in the middle of the palate, and then presents a second flavor. That's like just a
Mhm.
totally disjointed song to me. So we wanted it to be very even. Um, we wanted to have all the fruit that we needed, because the fruit, the top notes, when you recast them, get crunched.
Mhm.
So we had very fruit driven, very even, and very, very little tannin. And we made this blend. It was a blend of 20-year rye, 22, 23, 24, and 27-year-old corn. We made the blend, and then we recast it into French Limousine oak, ex cognac barrels, new American oak. We further matured it for an entire hot season. So like May to whatever, September. It was like 5 months. And then we actually re-blended all of those casks back together, and we didn't use all of it, by the way, which is so expensive. And that's how we made Peregrine. But it was such a cool, for us. It was so cool to look at barrel maturation from the other angle, and instead of just being like, okay, match the wood to the distillate, let's also match the liquid through blending to the wood maturation. And my God, did it work. It worked in one of those ways where in life there are times where things work out and you're just like, yes, okay, I had an idea and it worked. Um, that does not happen all the time when we're making
Mhm.
whiskey, and boy, did it work with Peregrine. And it's a process that we will delve a lot deeper into over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. I mean, so I had the opportunity to taste both Batch 8 and Peregrine, and um, they're both fantastic in their own right. But to me, and I wrote this. I'm not echoing what you said, but I wrote this before we ever even started. Is it felt more intentional in how it's constructed, right? And not that the other one had any missing spots or whatever, but it was great. But I felt like there was more nuance in the approach, more nuance in what was there, and it ends up being this really, really fantastic thing. And I didn't look at the front side of it when I tasted it. I flipped them around backwards, and my own little version of blind, because I knew you guys do a lot of different oaks, and my immediate thought was there's some French in here somewhere, right? And that's great for me because I really, really, really like French oak a lot. Um, and oftentimes I'll be like, "Yeah, you don't really know what you're doing." And I taste, I was like, I think there's French oak in here. And then I go look at it. I'm like, okay, this is what's actually in this thing. So I felt like really good about myself, but it absolutely feels more intentional. Not that the other one's not, but this one is like,
I I I I mean, the I love French oak too. I it's interesting. I tend to like French oak. I really like when French oak is a piece of it as opposed to
yeah,
the whole. So that worked out really well in this one, where because I think it can have some. Um, I think French oak can have some flavors that can overwhelm a little bit.
yep,
So it was. I thought it was great as a piece of it, and this yeah, this whiskey. It's also interesting. What we found is when you make a blend, when we make a blend, it takes a certain amount of time to integrate.
yep,
And part of that is simply you're using things that have different ABVs, and so they have to like it has to.
The
I'm not gonna ever
congeners don't
say this.
immediately mix. You know,
Right. They don't just they
you
don't just like, oh cool. They really need time to we say knit, right? It needs
yeah,
to like knit
you're taking
together.
two completely different solutions and mixing them together
Totally.
to try to create a new solution, right? And so
Totally.
because, whiskey is a mixture of ethanol and water, it's technically chemically a solution. So it is a solution, but
Yes.
maybe not the solution. But now you're taking two completely different ones that also have all of these other oils and
Yes.
and whatnot. And like, how do we get all of these things to play together? And it doesn't happen immediately. And
No.
on a very small scale, like I've got some nerdy friends and we're doing a nerdy thing, and so they all sent 5 bottles, and then I measured them out evenly into a different bottle and ship them back to them, and we're all gonna eventually drink the thing that's a part of this blend. But
Yes.
the
That's
the,
awesome.
the initial version of it, when I did 10 mLs of all of it, was like,
Ah,
oh Lord, we have made a terrible mistake. Now, after a month of it being in a bottle, it's perfectly fine, right? It had some
yes.
time to get friendly with each other. It feels an awful lot like I don't know if you're in a fraternity in college, but they have like opening weekend where everybody rushes, right? And you
Yeah.
put all of these people in the same room for the first time ever, and it can be very uncomfortable. But by the end of rush, everybody knows each other and it feels
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
friendly
Yeah.
and a lot
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
cohesive.
That's a funny way of thinking about it. I like that a lot. Yeah, no, I think the one of the interesting aspects of this is we with Peregrine when we made the initial blend, we gave it plenty of time to knit together and really like integrate. But what's
Mhm.
kind of cool that is underappreciated about this is we then took those things and put them in blends. I mean, sorry, in barrels before we reblended them. Those barrels very much acted as marrying casks as much as they were finishing casks, right? So like
Mhm.
obviously they're finishing casks, but I I've been to a lot of distilleries, and one of the things that's most fascinating is how long and how do these distilleries mingle their whiskeys and marry their whiskeys. And
Mhm.
I think partly because people are so terrified of saying the word blend or implying that things are blended, it can often
Mhm.
be overlooked on your standard tour, right? And you
Yep.
go to a place like Glenfiddich, and you don't really realize that hey, this is made 70% ex bourbon and 30% ex sherry, and it's like cool. How do you mix it together? And they were bold enough with the 15-year to be like, actually, we do a Solera vatting process, and
Mhm.
you know when I was a cynical non-whiskey producer, I was always like, "Oh, Solera, get the fuck out of here with you just wanted to
It
put a
felt like a
fancy
marketing gimmick,
word."
right? Like it
Yeah, you
feels
just
like a
want to put a
ploy.
fancy word on here. Now I'm like, "Oh man, that's so smart." Like, I wonder,
It's
we
almost like
should
they've known for a couple of 100 years what
it's
they're doing,
almost they've
right?
known for a couple hundred years that doing it, doing something that really improves the mingling. And you look at other industries where like they'll put shit in inert casks. They put stuff in
Mhm.
glass for 3 years.
Yep.
And these companies have been doing this for a long time because they've figured something out. And it's not always, I've learned to be less cynical, and it's not always, hey, we're trying to just do something fancy here, especially when it's expensive.
Right.
When it costs the company money, they're not doing it for fun. They're not just doing it for marketing. If it's really an expensive process, so I think one interesting thing that happened with Peregrine that was a side effect that I really have enjoyed is yes, we gave this plenty of time to mingle before we recast it. But we then took a blend that was still in the process of knitting together and we put it into these finishing casks and we gave it even more time to integrate. And then we reblended it all back together and gave it more time to integrate and sort itself out. And so
Mhm.
when I drink what's interesting about Peregrine is I write all our tasting notes online. So if you ever go and read our tasting notes and you're like, who's writing these wackadoodle like
No, 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 no. So I'm going to read you the question that I have because I specifically have a question around this,
yeah,
and I
tell me.
have the answer now because you've told me. Is it who writes the copy for your blends, and how do you intend to protect them from being hired away because of the style and content? So
Oh
I
man, I
don't think it's
appreciate that.
wackadoodle. There's obviously some care, and so that makes sense that it's you, right? Because it's the product that you're creating and you're intrinsically attached to it. But like Reader's Digest could hire you and you could go write for them, right?
Oh,
You can
thank you.
generate stories. There's enough
Thank you.
context here. So bravo.
No, I appreciate that. I And I'll answer that in a second, because what I was going to say about Peregrine was, when I write the tasting notes for everything that we make, it's very easy. I don't find it particularly hard to pick out certain flavor notes that I can describe. It's easy
Mhm.
for me to go, hey, batch 8 has a bunch of blackberry, and I know exactly where it came from. It came from this Madeira cask. And so it's very easy for me to go, hey, okay, there was blackberry here. This one is good molasses, and you get this integration of blackberry and molasses. Is delicious. Um, with Peregrine, I actually found it to be incredibly flavorful, but harder to describe. And Sammy, who's the other blender on our team, Sammy is was an absolutely brilliant is an absolutely brilliant mixologist. He's just a great bartender. And I remember early on, but like before we started Found North, when we were just friends in the industry, I went over and I was such a like cocktail cynic. I was like, why? If you have a great spirit, what the hell are you doing mixing it?
Mhm.
And so he was like, let me just teach you about mixology, and then you'll appreciate it. And one of the things that I remember him saying early on was, a great cocktail, you shouldn't be able to pick out the individual components. They should be so perfectly integrated that they create a new flavor.
Yep.
And I've thought a lot about that. I've thought a lot about that as we make whiskey. And one of the things that I appreciate about Canadian whiskey and blending Canadian whiskey is the Canadians are very intentional about making these. I think of them as layers of flavor. Um, and this is something that's always upset me when people talk about Canadian. I had a customer, a retail customer, once describe the grain whiskeys or the double distilled whiskeys that we use, the corn whiskeys that we use that are double distilled, um, or light whiskey that's made in blends, or the grain whiskey that's used for Scotch blends. He said, that's the in a burrito, that's the rice. He said, that's the rice. It's just the filling. And he was doing a presentation to, I was doing a presentation, but he was doing a presentation to everybody. So I didn't jump in there. I almost wish I had, but I was just like, oh man, that is a slap in the face. Like,
Mhm.
and, and I get why people think of single malt, or they think of, column into pot, like doubled, things that have been through a doubler. They think of this whiskey as like the complex whiskey where all the congeners and all the flavors coming from. And I get why they go, oh well, these grain whiskeys, they're not as dynamic, so this is the quote unquote filling. But it's the wrong way actually of thinking about it. I'm just gonna say, I don't like saying that it's the wrong way to think about things usually, but I'm gonna say it. It's the wrong way to think about it, because when you're blending and you have a super complex whiskey, it doesn't work to take another super complex whiskey and just slap them together. What you really need is to make a whiskey that's a sum of its parts, and is better than the sum of its parts. Is you need whiskeys that have these layers of flavor so that you can cleanly layer them into your blend. Um, and I've always thought about how to describe that. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I was like, all right, if you're making music and you think about like the keys on a piano, if you do a like a C major, the most basic chord, right? You do a C major, and it's three keys. If you play those keys individually, they each make a sound. If you play those three keys together, they don't make a combination of three sounds. They just make a new sound,
Mhm.
right? And when you're blending, if you can successfully take flavor one, two, and three, and not make a combination of those flavors, but rather make a new sound, a new flavor. That is literally the magic and the excitement around blending. And that's why people should get excited about it. And what's fascinating about Peregrine, to just tie this all back to where I was starting from, what's fascinating about Peregrine was, I thought when we made it, we had great flavors, but the way that they integrated through this process really truly made liquid, where when I was writing about it, I was having a hard time. I was sitting there going, what is this? How do I describe this richness, this fruit, this, like, how the hell, which one is it? Is it a melon? Is it this? Is it that? And I realized as I was describing it, I was like, more importantly, we really were able to create like compounds of flavors that were their own expression, and that's done something that's made Peregrine my favorite whiskey we've ever made, and it's made Peregrine something that's like really really close to my heart, and it's also made something where we're like, hey, we got to keep doing this process because it's doing
Mhm.
things that are really cool, that really are pushing our whiskey making in an awesome way.
And I liked this correlation. And here's the question that I have, or maybe the challenge that I have to pose to you, going back to the rice story, right? Where you said this is the rice of the burrito; it's just filler. And I don't think the insult is to the whiskey; the insult is to rice in that scenario, right? Because in a burrito, rice plays a specific role. It is a binder.
Yes,
It is a textural component. Like
yes,
if you take the
it's a really
rice
good
out
point.
of it, you're getting really close to just having a fajita, right? Which is a whole other thing, right? It has a different identity, it has a different set of components. And so not commodity rice,
I
not the
love
rice
that.
from Chipotle or whatever, but
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
well cooked rice. It has a key role in the creation of a burrito in the same way that that corn is doing the exact same thing. The guy had it right, but he was starting from the wrong impression that rice is just the filler in the burrito.
Yeah,
Maybe at Taco Bell, but if we're looking at the idea of a burrito, there's a reason why it's there, right?
right.
It's not just to add filling in because you could add in just beans or some other, like there's other components you could use as your primary filler. They all sort of play a role to create a final unique product in and of itself. Your explanation of chords on a piano or a guitar or any instrument for that matter, the single note is different than a combination of multiple notes put together that creates a new sound. And that's I think that's probably a more beautiful statement of what it's like to blend. But I think tell the guy with the rice he was right, but he's looking at rice the wrong way.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. And honestly, I was just thinking about uh you know, I have a real obsession with Japan.
Mhm.
I love Japan. I love Japan. And when I went there, the last time I went there, I took a sushi class. And I
Look,
just
rice is not just a component for them.
it's
Rice
not
is an
just a component.
important thing.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
temperature,
yeah.
it's a texture, it's a
It's a temperature, it's
you're
a
going to cook
texture,
it from one
totally.
way for one thing and one for the
Yeah,
other, and so
yeah,
it deserves some degree of respect in any culture.
totally,
And you by culture, it's like, do you wash the rice before you cook it or not? And it's going to depend on what country you're
yep,
in as to whether you wash the
yeah,
rice because it creates a different situation because you don't have as
totally.
much starch. So, anyways, like we can get super nerdy on a lot of things, but
I
we're
feel that.
we're talking a little bit about blending here, and so you've mentioned component whiskey a couple of times in here. In your world, right? So blending component whiskeys. What do you mean by component whiskey
Mm.
in what you're doing?
Yeah, when when we it's really interesting because when we look at when we look at one of the questions I get asked all the time. I don't know how other people describe these whiskeys, but one of the questions I get asked all the time is like, we got pushback when we made our single barrel program because our single barrels are not a bourbon single barrel where, hey, you make the liquid, you put it in the barrel, it ages, you bottle it.
Mhm.
And people said, well, yours is not really a single barrel, and I was like, well, this is how the rest of the world makes single barrels, and we happen to be part of the rest of the world, because the 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 way Canadian is made, if you were to take one of these singular components, if you were to take one of these single stream whiskeys, these whiskeys where it was like, this is 100% rye or this is 100% corn, and you just bottle it, you just take a single barrel of it, you just bottle it, you're doing a disservice to the whiskey. And frankly, we're not then adding any value. Um,
Mhm.
and and I and so all the time when I'm describing these whiskeys, I don't want people to think of them as like we're blending a complete whiskey one with a complete whiskey two. These whiskeys are distilled, they're fermented, distilled, and aged to not be a done whiskey, not be a complete whiskey. They're
Mhm.
designed to be a piece of a blend. And so I will always describe those as component whiskeys. Those are more of the raw ingredients that we're working with. But when we do something like Peregrine, where we've blended the whiskey and then we've put it into a finishing cask, I wouldn't necessarily call the liquid that's in there a component whiskey because it's
Mhm.
been blended, right? It's past the place where it was just kind of like the raw material. Almost if you think about like um, I haven't tried this analogy, so it might not work. But if you think about like uh, um, if you think about, for example, somebody who's making a piece of furniture, a rare piece of furniture, right? Like the lumber itself, that is like, oh, we have some sandalwood here, we have some mahogany, we have whatever, and we've grown it, processed it, lumbered it, milled it. Here it is. That's what those component whiskeys are like. Now,
Mhm.
when you then polish them and assemble them into a piece of furniture, like it's no longer components, right? This is the done product. And so that's kind of how I would think about it.
I think that's a really great analogy, right? Because you're talking about things that are meant to be put together eventually, right? And so we're looking
Right.
through maybe a United States centric viewpoint where for us the word component just means it is a piece of another thing, right? Like that's all it
Right.
is. And so technically anything that becomes a component. And so if blend, if you marry together Peregrine and then you put it in another barrel and you marry it again, technically that second
That was
state
a
is a
component. Okay.
component of the other one. And
Right.
that's how
Right.
we're looking at it. But when you're talking about component, you're talking about the raw material that becomes the initial blend, right? And then there's
Yes.
further transformation that occurs, and so
Right. Yes.
it's
Yeah,
the
you nailed it.
lumber, right? That's an appropriate statement. I think it's the lumber, and then you're refining it into the leg, right? And
Yep. Yep.
then you're turning it into the chair by marrying it to two other
Yeah.
legs
Yes.
and a back and a
Yes.
seat, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, and so that's
Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
it's you're
Yeah.
right. Like this is an appropriate kind of setup here. And so I've heard this before, right? And whenever you do your blends, you potentially like to listen to music. I think I heard you say this, like you put this here, and you already expressed that you know how to make some chords on pianos. So my immediate question is like, what are you listening to when you're blending? Like, what's the thing? Like, what's the genre? What's the style?
Um, it's very hard. Weirdly, it's pretty difficult for me to listen to anything while I'm blending that has words.
Okay.
So like as much as I love a bunch of different music from rock to alternative to there's really a lot of things that I like. I If it has words, it's really hard to blend with because I need to hear the voice in my head while I'm
Hmm.
while I'm blending. But no, I think one of my one of my favorite things to listen to is Bach, because he was such a um, some of the music is so intentionally technically on scales and so organized. Like he writes in a way that the music he wrote was just it's so perfectly organized, that there's something about listening to it that helps me organize the flavors because the really um the one of the really interesting things about taste and smell is we're not as naturally good at them as we used to be. So if
Hmm.
you think about us from like a fairly primal way, like tasting things used to be super important because we were starving all the time and we needed to know if we could eat this stuff and if it would poison us. And we need to remember that the stuff that we ate didn't poison us and smell it and know if it was rotten and things like that. And so we used to use our sense of smell in a very survivalist way. And now we're very visually driven as a species, right? And it's cool. Like I can close my eyes and I can right now picture your face and you got the Elijah Craig bottles behind you and I can, the shelving, like it's pretty easy for me to close my eyes and remember what I've been looking at. When you taste something, it's tricky actually to close your eyes and not like remember the words that are the flavors, right? It's one thing for
Hmm.
me to say like, "Hey, remember it's strawberry," right? Like, but to actually hold in your mind the flavor memory or the smell memory of something is actually it's quite difficult. and I can't do it if I am distracted by all the other work and all the other shit that's going on in my life. So if I've been working for 6 hours and then I decide I'm going to blend for 2 hours at the end of the day, and I'm thinking about, you know, financing and strategy and, you know, God, I got to get that barrel dumped and all this stuff, and I start tasting or drinking whiskey, I'm not going to actually be able to remember the particular flavors. And palate fatigue is your worst enemy when you're blending. When I have liquid, like, one of the things people don't appreciate is you pour yourself something and you've got a little whiskey in your glass and you sit there going, yeah, and you and I are talking and we're having a conversation. You're nuking your palate. You're
Yep.
you're making it, like, you may not be paying attention, but you're making it really, really, really difficult for your mind to further process information about that whiskey. Um, so so when I'm blending, I want to be really focused on what I'm tasting, and I'll literally do this. I'll go and I'll smell it once, and then in my head I'm going, what did this smell like? What, trying to hold the flavor in my head and picture it
Hmm.
and hold it there, and then imagine how it's gonna work with this other thing that I've just sniffed, you know? And so having, for whatever reason, I think I really think about music and whiskey as being much more interlocked than really anything else. Whiskey is always described um, verbally with, and often with, like, uh, tasting notes, or um, even sometimes in colors. And I get, like, I'm sure you know this. I know that you know what I'm talking about when you say something tastes green, right? Like,
Yep.
that's real. I know exactly what green tastes like to me. It's like
Hmm.
cellulose and a little herbaceous, and there's like a real distinct greenness to things. But for whatever reason, flavor gets much easier organized when I'm listening to certain types of music like Bach, and it also gets easier for me to block out all the other things that are going on in my life and be able to focus on the flavors when I have something that's in the background of my mind that's just acting as kind of a buffer from the rest of my thoughts. Um, I got to give a shout out to there's this musician, um, and I want to get his name right. But I listen to him constantly. His name is Joseph Tawadros, Tawadros, and he plays some of the, like, weirdest, coolest instrumental music, and not in your very sort of typical timing signatures. And when we're making new whiskey, when I'm like doing quality control, it's always straight up old school classical music that just helps me organize my thoughts. But when I'm making whiskey and I'm trying to think about something from a more inspirational standpoint, I like some of this kind of off kilter, slightly off the beaten path style music. And Joseph Tawadros is like, he's the guy. I highly recommend listening to History Has a Heartbeat.
Perfect. So it's obvious that you play and you play relatively well at the bottom end of the spectrum for sure, right? Because of the way you're describing music, right? Like you are a musician. I
No.
assume that you don't play at all.
No. I Okay, so I played drums growing up. Wasn't very
Hmm.
good at it. I sang in a choir when I was a kid. And have a uh passable voice. But I'm I'm obsessed. I really am obsessed with music, and mostly in the context of, um, I've been a competitive ballroom dancer for the last 15 years. So I like think about music. I think about
Okay, so
timing
that makes sense with
signatures.
the timing
Yes,
signatures and
yes,
understanding how it's put together. That makes
yes. But I'm
so
not
like my,
actually
my
a good
assumption was like you're a
musician.
piano player, but that
I've
I
played a
don't know a
little
ton about
piano,
ballroom
couple
dancing, but
years,
it
but
makes
really
far more
like,
sense that you're going to understand
yeah,
the musical signature of something because you have to pattern your dance to that. And so
yes.
that may be even more interesting than a piano player as a ballroom dancer, right? So that's something new. Um, and I like the imagery that, piano and whiskey go together very well, at least classical piano, because, you know, you, classical piano can be, you're kind of talking about, it's very, very technical, right? So Bach is very
Yes.
technical. It's almost mathematic in its nature,
Yes,
and
it
the art of
is.
it comes in
Totally.
how it's played, right? Because you can put together the signature structure. At least most of the time with most music, you can put together a very specific signature of the music, and you can push it out, and even if it's not artfully done, people will like it because it matches other patterns that they're used to. And if you're a classic
Right.
rock fan, hip hop fan, there's signatures that people reuse over and over again, and you see this even in religious songs where they have a very similar pattern, and so they create this emotion always, even if the music's played terribly, right? Because most
Yep.
music is going to be played terribly, but how well it's done becomes the art portion of it, in the same way that whiskey is science, but good whiskey is science and art, right? And so now it's,
Yes.
you've completed the equation, but how do you create this other portion of it? And so,
Totally.
if I'm drinking Peregrine, what should I be listening to replay how Nick Taylor put it together?
All right. So the first thing I would say is the way our team is structured. I really always try to say that. I try to say this every time we have because I get to be the person who talks.
Hmm.
And that's like just the structure of our company. It's almost always me in front of a camera. It's always me in front of an audience. Um, I do not do 50% of the work when it comes to making the whiskey. There's no chance that I own a majority of the work. So what I before I answer that, I just want to make it clear, like, yeah, I get to be the person who has the title head blender, and I get to be the person who goes out and talks about this and talks about what I was thinking about and what we were thinking about. Um, but this is wholly a team. This is
Hmm.
wholly a team process. And Sammy was my brother came up with the idea of using three different barrel types and then reblending them. And Sammy was largely responsible for executing, finding the actual wood, and then we put together the final product really as a team. So what I personally would recommend listening to this and take that as like, hey, one of the creators, not the creator of Peregrine. What I
Hmm.
would take, what I would listen to this. Um, um, okay, this is a this comes the song that this just like immediately popped into my head um is uh is probably has to be from the Graceland album. um I'm a I'm totally like I couldn't begin to tell you how obsessed I am with Simon and Garfunkel and Paul Simon in general. The
Okay.
Graceland album is by far my favorite album, and the yeah, it's gotta be You Can Call Me Al, baby. I think it just has to
I
be
love
that.
that song.
I love that song, and I just think the part where where he says like you see angels in the architecture, that like that's the song in my fantasy world that people associate with this whiskey. I would hope that people would do that. And I would like to state that as with as much humility as possible because I genuinely believe that that is one of the best songs ever written. I think it's so good, and I don't want to sit here and go, and this is one of the best whiskeys ever made. Like I don't want people to
Right.
believe that because I think this song is the one that I want associated with, that I think that those are on the same playing field. That would be a dream come true. But yeah, I'm in love with that song, and when I taste this, particularly, there's something about the top notes of this whiskey when I think about
Mhm.
like the bright sort of fruit florality of it, um, and it still has like this clean base, but there's something about the organization and the integration of the different verses of that song and the way they meld together, um, that and kind of the way that uh, I think with Paul Simon, what I love the most about him is the way that he's able to alternate within a song between almost like this spoken poetry vibe, to this really beautiful singing. And I think the this whiskey is without a doubt a whiskey. When you drink it, you're not like, oh, I'm drinking some weird spirit. Like this is it's fundamentally a whiskey. It has the pieces of a whiskey that I absolutely love. But some of those top notes, the music really comes through on this whiskey and it really sings. And so that's yeah, no, I like that you asked me that question. I have to really think about it, but I'm
I,
delighted.
it's very well answered, so that's appropriate. I'll make sure later on tonight. I'm gonna pull that up. I have that song. I love that song. I don't. I
Yes.
might have it on vinyl. I might look out and have that on vinyl downstairs and see what happens. But if not, I know there's a guy that lives across the road from me that probably does. And my dad lives across the road from me, and he's got a significant vinyl
Okay.
collection. And so it's not that like I'm creeping on my neighbors inside of their house. I just
I had my best customer when I was in retail was a total audiophile
Mhm.
and has built over the years this sound system, piece by piece that is just ridiculous. I mean,
Mhm.
just so ridiculous. And uh, when I visit him, it like I just want to grab out the audiophile version of Graceland and play it on vinyl over and over and just listen to it in its
Mhm.
purity and it's just
In its most
it's
perfect
great.
sense, right?
Yes,
Yeah, aside from
yes.
maybe live sitting next to the man while he's playing the song, I think that's
But
the next
honestly,
closest thing you can get, you know?
with live, and I've had this thought when I'm sitting there because like it sounds like the system is so good and the sound stage is so good. The way you hear the sound is so good that
Mhm.
it sounds like he's right there playing it. You just close your eyes and you're like, oh, he's there, and the guy playing the bongos is over there. You know what I mean? You're like you
Yep,
can really
yep,
feel it. But as I
spatial.
was thinking about it, I was like, live. The excitement about live is the feeling of like being in a crowd that's all
Community. It's community,
community,
like,
right? It's like
it is absolutely that, community,
it's
yes.
and I think the quality of the music in itself is actually probably not as good
Worse.
as
No, no, no,
the
it's worse.
best
It's
vinyl
100
recording,
listen
which
to a
is you
live
get the
album, right?
community
Like,
piece of it,
you know,
right? Yeah.
it's one of my favorite bands of all time because I grew up in that area was Nirvana, right? And so, like,
Yes.
the live album that they did is one of the most impactful live albums, but it's also not their best music
No.
because it's live, right? And there's mistakes that happen, but that's also what makes it great too, right? Because it's not maybe the best technical music, but it's the best environment, and there's a human element, and it's not produced, and it's not all of these things, and then,
Totally.
it all fits, right? And so now we're at the point where we have talked about Rice, vinyl records, Paul Simon, Bach, Scotch, ballroom dancing, Schroeder. Like these are the
Or just
these are the
whiskey. Yeah.
conversations that I really, really appreciate. So when you get close to a blend, what does that process look like? Because you said there's two other people. Do your brother and Sammy have any input with the final
Oh
blend, or
yeah.
is it
Oh
like
god, yeah.
that's your
Yeah,
okay?
yeah. No, no, no. Yeah. So most of the blending process is done by Sammy and me in conjunction.
Mhm,
And one of the hardest things was figuring out the language, because writing about whiskey and communicating about the structure of whiskey are very very different.
mhm,
Um, and I'm delighted that you like the writing on our website because when I'm doing that, I'm trying to communicate in a way that makes the whiskey sound appealing, obviously, right? Like I want to
mhm,
highlight the good things about the whiskey. That's part of the reason why you describe it. But I've also tried to integrate a little bit of how we think about the structure of whiskey. So in the same sort of music analogy, if I asked you what do you like about Graceland, and you just started listing out a number of the different chords that were used in Graceland without thinking about how those chords are structured over time, you're doing a massive disservice to the whiskey. And I appreciate that we try to write these tasting notes and try to communicate to consumers so that they can make decisions about whether they want to buy something or not. But this idea of like saying like here are the 10 things on the nose, here are the 10 things on the palate, and here's the 10 things on the finish, and this is an accurate description of the experience of drinking the whiskey is like such a snippet, and it's such a
Mhm.
deconstruction of the actual experience of whiskey, which happens over time. And so I think for us, when we're discussing blends, what became very tricky was like, okay, you have a blend, you like it, now we're tweaking it. It's changed and the tasting notes have changed, but the tasting notes aren't really actually that important for assessing whether the whiskey is improved or not. What's
Mhm.
really important is understanding, does this whiskey have better or worse structure over time? And what I mean by that is like, the first thing we want in any whiskey we make is a great landing. So people talk about like nose palate finish, right? Nose palate finish. And for fuck's sake, the most important thing isn't the nose palate or the finish. It's the entry. It's the landing. It is everybody remembers the way that the the way that a whiskey hit them, right? And it's like um I it's like that 7 year wilderness trail that I was talking about earlier. Not to just constantly talk about my own
Mhm.
whiskey, like that 7 year wilderness trail. The reason that it's sticking in my mind is because it landed with this like fresh, minty baking spice, uh, French bakery note that then translated and did really interesting things and evolved, and that was why I thought it was a beautiful whiskey. But the thing that I have a real sense memory for is, how did this whiskey land? And when I think about what I love about like some of my favorite brands, the 2015 small batch limited edition from Four Roses, such an underrated whiskey. That thing is an absolute banger, and it lands with this cinnamon sugar baking spice that I'm obsessed with, that you'll find in a lot of our whiskeys. But it just hit with that plus um a bourbon-esque florality, something that's just unique to bourbon, this unique bourbon-esque sort of florality and fruit note, red fruit note, and it did it just perfectly. It was a perfect chord. I remember telling Brent Elliott when he asked me what he was asking me, like what I liked of his, and I told him, I said, Brent, when you made SBLE 2015, it it reminds me of In My Life by the Beatles, the first opening of In My Life. Barrel, 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 barrel. And he was like, I think that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about any of my whiskeys, because he knew exactly what I was talking about. It
Mhm.
was like the entry to a song that just catches your attention. So when Sam and I were first starting to blend, getting our language right about, these are the different pieces of the different pieces of the palate and the different pieces of the experience. There's obviously the nose, but then there's the way the whiskey hits and the way it spreads across the palate as you go through the experience of drinking it. And I don't just mean the liquid washing over those pieces of the palate. I also mean the way that our brain processes the signals over a piece of time, and the sides of the palate evolve from maybe being tannic to more baking spice, right? You go from like wood spice to baking spice, or you have those different experiences uh, as it progresses. And so when Sammy and I are blending, the first thing that we got right was simplifying our language as it comes to tasting notes. I don't need to hear about chamomile tea. Like, I don't know what chamomile tea tastes like. I'm sorry, I don't drink a lot of it. You know what I mean? Like, that tasting note's fucking irrelevant to making good whiskey. What I want to
Right.
know is it sweet? Does it have enough body? Is there enough body throughout the palate? Does it have enough tannin? Does it have enough grip? Right? You and I both know what grip is. Like a
Mhm.
whiskey that's got great grip, where it latches onto your palate and it sticks there throughout. Right? That's great grip. So the first thing was getting our was matching our language to the point where he can taste something over the phone and say, this is what I'm tasting, this is what I think this is missing. And regardless of whether I'm actually physically drinking the whiskey at the same time as him or not, I know exactly what he's talking about. And we can go
Mhm.
back to our components and say, well, this whiskey component has a lot of texture to it. And so maybe we'll bump that up by 2 or 3%. And then we'll try it. And that's how the sort of back and forth happens. And then what we usually do is, you don't want your it's tricky because we'll be working multiple different formulas at the same time. So if we're
Mhm.
like, okay, 50% of this, 30% of this, and 20% of this. This is one formula. Okay, but at the same time, we've been trying this other formula that's 60% of something completely different, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want to describe these whiskeys by listing out the liquid that's in it, right? That's a
Hmm.
pain in the ass. So usually when we have a formula that we like, we'll name the formula, often something truly ridiculous. The
Hmm.
formula that ended up being the iteration and iteration that finalized and was Bad Shade, we called Bronco, because the rye component that was aged in Madeira was like a bucking bronco. It was really hard to tame this thing, and so we
Hmm.
we named it Bronco, and we called it, okay, this is Bronco Prime, and it would be Bronco P, and then we list out the formula, right? And then each tweak where we go, okay, what if we add 5% this or 3% this, or take this up and take this down, we would name Bronco 1, Bronco 2, Bronco 3, Bronco 4, Bronco 5, Bronco 6, right? And then we go through and you can look, okay, as we're moving this formula around, what's happening to the different pieces of the palate? What's happening over the course of this experience of drinking this whiskey? And that's how you can iterate and look back and go, okay, we were trying to fix the landing, or we were trying to fix this, and it worked here and we started doing this, but if you go back to Bronco 4, the this piece was way better. So what do we do here that worked, but what's happening in this formula, and where do we maybe find something that's a combination of what's happening in Bronco 4 and what's happening in Bronco 7? And this is literally, I'm walking you through it. This is exactly how our process goes. From a practical standpoint, we usually, when we get to finalizing a whiskey, we usually are getting down to maximum four test blends per sitting, and we're really really careful about it. You can't sit there, if you take a test, if you take 5 minutes with one of your test blends, you've nuked your ability to accurately
Hmm.
assess test blend 2, 3, and 4. So we will usually do 4 test blends. We will usually do those 4 test blends before we eat. Um, and we often are doing them together. We find it easier to do it in the same room, which means he has to drive from upstate New York all the way out to me in Boston. Um, and then once we've settled on it, we get confirmation with each other, and we say this is the best one, and it's done. Because a lot of times we'll sit there and go, this is the best one, but
Not done.
it's not done. So either we have to keep going, or if we think that this is a dead end, we need to go look at a different formula and see if we can iterate down that and find something that's better than what we're making right now. Um, so we do that. That's our process, but we integrate the other guys on our team, because both my brother and Phil have superb palates. But what they have that we don't have while we're doing the blending is a clean slate, right?
Yep.
Because what happens, like, and one of the funniest things was when I used to host tastings, and people would taste like 6 things, and they would get tunnel vision, and I remember I would host these distillers or these brands where I didn't like any of the whiskey. But that
Hmm.
doesn't mean nobody's going to like none of the whiskey, and some of it is whatever, and people like it. So, hey, I would host the brand ambassador or whatever, and he or she would come in and pour 6 whiskeys. And I remember what would always blow my mind is the fourth or fifth whiskey would be the best whiskey from the portfolio, and people would always go this, and they buy it. And I can't tell you how many times people came in the next day with the bottle and go, "Hey, I bought this. I opened it. There's something wrong with the bottle."
Hmm.
And I'd be like, really? Okay. And I'd taste it and be like, this tastes like this brand. And I'd be like, huh, like and he'd be like, do you taste that like sour note or whatever it is? And I'd be like, okay. And we'd go back into the back, and I'd grab the bottle we had poured the night before, and I'd pour them next to each other. And the person would sit there going, holy shit, this is exactly the same. And
Hmm.
and so what happens when you're constantly tasting stuff that's of the same ilk or going down the same formula is, yes, this whiskey might be better than this whiskey, but is it good in a vacuum?
Right.
And so when we start to feel like we're getting tunnel vision, that's when it's really useful to bring Phil or Zach in and say, what do you think of this formula? You're coming into this completely cold. We blend it up for you, and they taste it. And you can't imagine how many times they'll taste it and be like, this is really good. I think this is really interesting. Guys, like, this is really bitter on the finish. And we're
Hmm.
like, really? And then we go back and we're like, holy shit, this is really bitter on the finish, but it's less bitter than these last six things we've made. So
Right.
our brains have not processed that this is still quite bitter. And then that gives us a nice reset. We put it down, we come back to it, we say, okay, this we have a bitterness problem. Is this formula salvageable? What do we need to do to it until we get to the final blend? Um, Now, that's all well and good when you're designing a blend, but it doesn't necessarily scale up. So we have to do the whole fucking process again once we actually have all the liquid lined up. Because you
Right.
pull all these things, you've add them together, and you start scaling it up. And guess what? It doesn't mingle the way you expect, and you got to tweak it. And there's so that's like the designing the prototype process. But then
Hmm.
there's actually getting it all the way vatted and bottled, and there are another 15 technical steps and quality control steps that we go through at that point.
That's it's an intense process, and what it reminds me of is, and going back to the conversation around vinyl records, in album creation in the days of vinyl, they were very intentional about what track one does, two does, three does, four does, because it was really hard to start on song three, right? Because you got to
Right.
find the tiny little
And then
groove,
you,
and you got to
and you have
drop
to
the needle
place it.
just right, and then you get to hear that song. And so they created a journey, and what you're describing is also the exact same way that I've heard. I won't say exact, wasn't exact words, but the process is almost identical to what Dixon Deadman does whenever he's creating a blend. Is that it's not
Interesting.
about flavor notes; it's about how it feels in the mouth, where it goes, what it does, how it starts, how it finishes, how does it play as a journey of whiskey,
Yes.
and then you can get into the maybe the finer nuance of I would like to see more of this bright fruit
Right.
note, right?
Right.
But if it doesn't feel right in the mouth, it doesn't matter, right? Because then you have a problem with
Right.
thinness or thickness or astringency or whatever else. And so you start with mouthfeel and then you build from there.
Totally.
And like I said, it's exactly what people did with albums for a very, very long time, because it wasn't easy to just pick up in the middle. And with whiskey, you can't just pick up in the
You
middle
can't
note,
just pick them in
right?
the middle. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And
It's not a process.
the other, I think the other, we usually, so like, okay, this batch eight, right? Batch eight on the label, it says ex Madeira. Um, to be very clear, that's one of the components. It was just one of the
Mhm.
component whiskeys. We didn't take the whole blend and then put it in Madeira. Like that's just one component, and it's not even the majority of the liquid. What this is the anchor. So
Mhm.
there was something very uh, uh, unique and interesting about what this rye was doing in Madeira, and we built the entire blend around it, right?
Mhm.
And and that is so that's the other piece of this whole thing, which is like it's great to keep iterating and and keep trying to improve it, um, as long as you don't iterate out of the intention of the actual blend, right? So the intention when we made batch eight was, okay, we have a style that is these corn dominant whiskeys that we make. We have a style that's very specific to Found North. Not to say other people couldn't or don't make whiskey that tastes anything like us, but like this is a signature style of Found North that, for the time being, who knows where we'll keep going, but for the time being, this is a signature style, and we don't want to just like we could take similar components and just start slapping them together, and you'd make something that was kind of the profile, but probably just naturally a little different than seven and then six. But that's not a very intentional way of making whiskey. And when we think of the batches and we think about the whiskey we've made, we think about what the previous batch did. We're not doing it in a vacuum. You're not sitting there just being like, okay, clean slate, let's make another really good whiskey, or let's try to make another really good whiskey, right?
Mhm.
The question with batch eight was, okay, we want to do another one of these corn dominant whiskeys. What's unique about this one, and how does it iterate off of what we've done in the past? Batch seven, we got into brighter, more floral notes. batch 8, we were like, we have this rye that makes this thing sultry and like,
Mhm.
has this like really kind of um I always think like New Orleans jazz vibe to it, right? It's got this like heavy blackberry twang to it. And so when we were making the blend, it's not just about like, all right, let's get all these pieces right. If we got all the pieces right, but we lost the soul of the blend, we don't have a blend. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So it's like
Right.
the thing isn't just iterating to a certain goal. It's about making sure that the journey of the whiskey also is built around and focuses around a key component or a key aspect that is the theme of the story that is that whiskey.
So you mentioned that you guys like you've over time developed a signature style. And we're going to use air quotes there because I don't know if it was intentional that the style was developed, but that is what it is now. And you also mentioned that doesn't mean it won't change, but it doesn't sound like that there's any specific intention to change it. Like what would it take to put you in a position where you say, all right, here's our signature style, and we want to depart from that? Like, what's the thing that would happen? To be like, all right, we're making a change here.
I This is like one of the absolute hardest pieces of the puzzle for us, because there's a real temptation to just go, this is what we make. We did the batches, but this is what we make, and now we're just making this, and people like it. We can sell out. We can grow the brand. Great, thumbs up. You know what I mean? And I understand why people do that. And to be really frank, like I think I don't know, how do I say this? There's a degree to which I think people who make whiskey um, do so in a vacuum sometimes. And they're just like, I make this whiskey because this is the style that I want to make, and some people are going to like it, and some people aren't going to like it, and that's cool. And I have a lot of respect for um, brands like Lafroig are a great example of that, right? It's just like, fuck you, we make this iodine like, you know, it's super rubbery, a little bit
It's
sulfur,
divisive. It
and
is. You're
it's
either on the
divisive,
team or you're
and
not.
you're
There's
either on
no
the
in
team or you're
between.
not. And this is what we make. And I love that they do that. I love that they embrace that, and they iterate within that space extremely well. And like, tip of the hat. I love that. Um, the way we think about this though is, um, we want like we want the consumer to feel a real closeness to the brand of
Mhm.
Found North. Like I want people to people talk all the time about transparency, and I'm I kind of feel like transparency a little bit has gotten away from the point, in the sense that like transparency, all the time people will ask like, hey, can you tell me everything about every little component that's in this? And I'm like, I could, yes, but you're getting a little bit away from what the point of transparency is. I'm not giving you the transparency so that you can count up the percentage of 12-year-old versus 15-year-old versus 23-year-old versus 25-year-old, and then try to quantify the quality of this whiskey based on the stats. That's like, it's again, it's like deconstructing a painting of the Mona Lisa by just describing how much of each shade of paint was used in it, right? It's
Mhm.
like you're missing the picture of the beautiful woman here. And so I think the reason that I really value transparency as a consumer, as somebody who sold whiskey for a long time, and now as somebody who makes whiskey and wants to be transparent about it, is um, there is an interaction between the producer and the maker of whiskey. We make it, y'all drink it, and then tell us whether you like it or not. And that absolutely dictates to what we make next, you know?
Mhm.
And so I want people who are buying, and by the way, people spend a lot of fucking money on Found North, and I love them for it. Like, we don't exist if people aren't willing to spend hard-earned money to buy our product.
Mhm.
And like, I think it's a bit of a disservice to them and to the community of people who support Found North to not explain to them the intentionality behind the liquid, to reveal what we were trying to do and give that coloring and that context that you and I were talking about earlier in the podcast. Like, if we're not giving them that, we're kind of, we're one, neglecting the fact that they are literally involved in the making, whether they know it or not. We don't make batch one and batch three anymore, or anything that's like it. Not because we don't necessarily think they're good whiskeys, but because the call and response aspect of making whiskey is that people really want us to make batch eight and make something like batch eight. So that's all to say, like, there's a degree to which there's a real temptation where it's like, okay, you guys like this, we make this. But that would also be neglecting the aspect of this that's really fun, which is it's an ongoing journey, and we're going to keep exploring, and we're going to keep pushing the envelope as to what we make. And so, for us, figuring out that balance and being like, hey, we've had a lot of calls for us to make another weeder. We've had a lot of calls for us to make more rye and go back to rye, right? And I think, like, we want to do that in some capacity, and we want to make whiskey that scratches that itch for us and scratches that itch for people who've had batch one, three, and five. Um, and at the same time, we want to continue to explore in this quote unquote signature profile. So with things like Peregrine, Peregrine is very, it's fundamentally different from batch six, seven, and eight, and that was
Mhm.
intentional, and that was exciting, and people like it and have responded well to it, which gives us the freedom to keep doing this process of, blend, finish, blend, and who knows, maybe 3 years from now, we make an occasional straight blend like batch six, seven, and eight, and the predominantly we're doing this, this Peregrine style whiskey that's called something else.
Mhm.
I honestly, I couldn't tell you. There isn't a master plan, for Found North. It's a lot more exploration. It's a lot more call and response. It's a lot more, what do people like? What do they want from us? And then how does that match what we want to make and what we think is exciting?
Mhm. And it puts you in this place where it feels like you're given more license to innovate instead of satiate,
Yes.
right? Like the consumer says they like this, but they came to you because of your innovation. Should
Yes.
you break that mentality to keep them forever? Because now the thing that brought them to you, you're continuing to make over and over again. And I
Totally.
think you mentioned transparency, and I appreciate there's a handful of brands that are really focusing on transparency to the degree that they can without giving up trade secrets. And I think from a consumer's perspective, the reason we're interested in transparency is not that I want you to be able to tell me all the way down to the geographic place in the world where that corn was harvested. Like, I don't necessarily want you to tell me that. Now, I want to know that you can, right? And this is a part of the conversation that I had earlier, is that you understand enough of what you're doing, not maybe not you specifically, but specifically for someone who does distill, they're buying grain from someone, right? And
Yep.
where do they get their grain from? And what is that person doing to it? Do you know? Because if you know, and I'm trusting you, then I'm trusting you with my health, my money, my all of these different things.
Right. Right.
I don't need to specifically know. I just need to know that you feel good about what you're doing because I am putting trust in you. And then,
Right.
if anything ever does happen, I also feel comfortable that you have the quality controls in place to say, hey, this doesn't meet our standard anymore. We're not going to. And there's a lot of distilleries that buy tons of commodity grain and can't do that. And so I don't expect a whole lot from their whiskey, right? And so if they're going to charge me $17 for it, I don't expect to know where it came from, right? If I'm going to spend $400 for it, I want to know that they know, right? Like, I
Yeah.
don't
Yes.
have to
Yes.
know, and that's
Yes.
what we've talked a little bit earlier, but the Waterford brand, they're really getting in a terroir and being able to tell it, but because that's what they want to talk about, is that what is the flavor impact of this grain on this space.
Yep.
Not everybody needs that, not everybody wants that, but the reality is, a consumer wants to know that you care enough about the product that's going into it. And when you spend 2.5 hours on a podcast with a guy from Western Kentucky talking about your brand and the intentionality of it, it's evident, right? So you're
Yep.
selling trust in you and in your brand more than you're selling Peregrine First Flight, right? And so I'm
Yep.
going to also note that it says First Flight, right? Um, I saw there's another. There was a batch. I think it was batch 6 that had first flight and second flight because it was popular and it was much smaller. But I assume there's a second one of these that's coming.
Oh, we'll make another Peregrine. There's no question. And what's fun is we got to design the blend
Mhm.
now. Right there's because we need the time to marry it. We got to design it. We got to scale it up. We got to marry it, and we got to get that done before the temperature warms up. Because with the way we do this, we want our further maturations to happen when it's warm out. Because
Right.
look, the real thing about barrel aging is so much of the wood extraction happens in the first 200 days. The rest of the effects are concentrative and evaporative. They're oxidative. There are these other things that are happening that require time and things like this. But if what you're really trying to do is put something in, a French limousine oak and get something out of that, it's going to happen much more during the summer than it is during the winter. So we've gotten onto this
Mhm.
cycle now where it's like, okay, it was awesome selling batch 8, selling Peregrine, delightful. We're going to have a little Christmas break here. And then it's like all of January, all I'm going to be doing is blending. I mean, there's not going to be literally anything. It's going to be Sammy moving in and the two of us blending like fiends, so that we can get all
Mhm.
of these different projects going and make batch 9 and make, the next seasons of single barrels and do all these things.
So I assume, and maybe I'm assuming wrong, but I assume that if you're doing aging, you have a storage facility potentially somewhere near you where you are
Yeah, Dover, New
geographically, right?
Hampshire. Yeah.
Okay, so you're talking in New Hampshire. Is this? I don't know how to phrase this without trying to ask like too deep of a question, but like, so you're purchasing Canadian whiskey that is aged in Canada for a period of time, right? Are you moving significantly geographically south to where you're seeing more impact, or is your aging similar in nature? Because
You'd be
I mean,
surprised. Yeah, yeah,
depending
I know
upon the part
exactly
of
what you're
New
getting at.
Hampshire, right?
Yeah,
It could
yeah, yeah,
it,
yeah.
a couple of hours south of me is distinctly different temperature wise
Yes.
than it is right now where I'm at. But there's also a lot more variation here, right? We're at the Kentucky Tennessee line.
Yeah,
We start getting into subtropical
yeah.
climates
It's
in
it's a
Florida and
really
whatnot.
interesting. We've flirted with the idea of like, well, what if we just took some barrels and we don't have to store them in Dover, New Hampshire. We could we
Mhm.
could get liquid. We could bring it down to the Florida Keys if there's a warehouse down
Right.
there, and you could do something. You could really mess around with aging by just not tweaking, completely changing
Mhm.
your environment. And honestly, we picked over New Hampshire because it's an excellent facility, and it's in a place where our whole team can get there relatively easily.
Mhm.
It was not a romantic decision of like, yes, we've replicated our Canadian brethren, and
Mhm.
and that being said, it is relatively similar. The aging conditions are relatively similar to a lot of the places where Canadian whiskey is being made, which
Well,
is what I can
and,
say without violating my
yeah,
NDA.
yeah, and I think that that feels more appropriate than trying to, unless you're doing an experiment and you want to,
Yeah,
send it to,
yeah,
the southern tip of Texas, right, or to
totally.
the
Be cool.
northern tip of Maine, right, or not maybe Maine because we're still talking Canada. If we're going to Alaska, so you're going to send it to
Yeah,
Alaska and
yeah,
see what
yeah,
happens there. And odds are, at least if you're looking to try to age it for a summer or maybe even two, um, just as long as your temperature can exceed about 80 degrees on a regular basis, you're
oh
probably
yeah,
doing just fine
you're
for
fine.
aging, right? Like
Yeah,
that's what you're really after. Is that,
yeah,
in Kentucky, our big thing is the significant swing from 150 in a rick house down to 28 degrees in the winter and back up again, and
right.
that happens multiple times a year. The summertime is probably when there's a good amount of aging that happens in Kentucky in the summertime, but I think where it really probably does its most significant is in the fall and spring whenever we're up to 90 degrees and then we drop down to 30 degrees at night, right? And so we're seeing far
That's
more fluctuation in
That's
temperature.
cycling. I'm so curious about that. I got asked about this. I think last night somebody was asking about this, and I was talking about Old Forester and some of the heat cycling
Mhm.
stuff they're doing, which is really cool. And I'm really I would love to just get an opportunity to talk to those guys and just be like, what's it doing? You know,
Yeah.
and I think I think one of the really fun things about whiskey is and I've had this conversation numerous occasions with Harriet Watt trained master distillers, and I'll go, okay, when you do the molecular chromatography of the liquid, um, are you do you feel more informed about what the compounds are in your whiskey, or does it get more convoluted? And every single time, people are like, I mean, these are like PhD microbiologists, chemists, distillers, and they're going, I get the molecular chromatography back, and I don't know what the fuck is going on. You know, like what is that? I'll get the reading, and it'll say, you know, various varying sulfuric compounds, and it's like, yeah, which ones and what are they, and why can't you tell me the molecular structure of the and what I what I'm getting at here is um, I have had, in my experience, visiting distilleries, talking to everybody I can, because look, I have no degree in chemistry. I've learned everything I've ever
Mhm.
learned about whiskey. I've had to go hunting for each little bit of information, and I have had guys who you know, people I won't name, um, but I've had distillers who I have like the most respect for on earth tell me not just different things,
Mhm.
directly opposing information
Opposing.
that they
Yep.
are 100% sure is correct. This, you know, as far as I have had people say, heat cycling is irrelevant. All that matters is the maximum heat, which creates maximum. And I have had the complete opposite told to me, that all that matters is what you just said, which is like the swings and how frequent we're having them. I
Mhm.
have had so much completely disparate information. And what's really cool about that is it means that there's tons of room for experimentation
Yep.
without people knowing exactly what the hell is going to happen. And that's like one of the most exciting things about the whiskey industry is you sit there, and I had no appreciation for things like glass. You know, if I get the money, and Zach, my brother Zach, will tell me whether we have the money for it or not. But if I get the money, like I would love to get a big, like a massive demijohn, like a really big demijohn,
Uh-huh.
and just put some liquid in there, you know, make a blend, mingle it, and then just put a bunch of it into the demijohn and see what happens over the course of like 2 years. Put it in there and just see what changes, because I no longer believe that those things are inert. I no longer believe, and it's not because somebody has sat there and gone, "Here's the facts, here's the chemistry, Nick." Like you
Right.
know, we have the data, we know exactly what it is. I'm intrigued by it because other people swear by that kind of thing, and they do that, and I want to explore, and I want to see what they're doing, and I want to talk to them, and see if it makes our whiskey better, because we're definitely that obsessed with the little marginal gains. I think the whole thing is about the little marginal gains, the little places where you can tweak
Mhm.
your process and make it better, and make slightly better liquid, and make something that is just more beautiful because of the aggregate.
Well, and marginal gains in something like whiskey can be significant in the way that I would personally probably look at it is like, um, if you're 1 degree off of perfect, it doesn't matter at 10 feet, but it matters at 25 miles, right?
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah,
whiskey is a long-term speculative goal here, right?
totally.
Where we're going to put it in a barrel and we're going to let it go for however long it goes. And so that 1 degree widens very significantly the farther out it goes. And if we start from Earth and we go to the moon, 1 degree puts you just hovering in space, right? If you're 1 degree off starting, you're wrong. And so if you're looking for the marginal gains, I mean, the marginal gains are where it's going to win. um, in whiskey, it feels like if you're looking at a long game. If you're looking at 3 years, you're probably fine. If you're looking at, you know, 18 to 24-year-old whiskey or 18 to 26-year-old whiskey, marginal gains are where you win. absolutely
Marginal
where
gain,
you win.
totally. And I think like one interesting thing is we find that there's value in agitating the liquid.
Mhm.
And so uh, you know um, I think one of the most successful marketing campaigns in whiskey history has to be Jefferson's Ocean.
Uh-huh.
Um, like you just it is it's so captivating. And I remember, again, cynical. I'm just way more of an optimist about whiskey than I used to be. I was a real cynical
Yeah.
asshole when I was like buying it and talking about it all the time. Actually, I was still optimistic, but I was just more cynical than I am now. Now I'm the biggest optimist you can possibly
Yeah.
imagine. I think everybody's doing cool, great stuff, and I just want to talk about it and hear about it and drink it. Um, but I remember, like, I was so cynical about Jefferson's Ocean. People come in and be like, "Does it do anything?" And I was like, "It is just a total gimmick. It doesn't do anything." And I remember talking to one of the wine buyers at the liquor store while I was working there, and somebody brought it up, and I said, "I don't think it does anything." And he just, he said, that, like, when Madeira was when Madeira was king, like hundreds of years ago, when Madeira was something that people really cared about, um, people used to study and buy Madeira based on the shipping route of where it went, because there were these, like, well-worn shipping routes at shipping times, and people learned that it was affecting the Madeira. Um, and of course, that has to do with the changing of the environment and the changing
Right.
of the heat, but also, I imagine, it had to definitely do with agitating the liquid all the time. How rough were the seas, things like this. And so now I'm like, now in my old age, I look at Jefferson's Ocean, and I'm like, huh. Okay. Okay. I'm more of an open mind about this. I'm curious. Like, where'd you take the barrels? How rough were the seas? What were you doing? Were you agitating? How big was the barge? I'm like totally more open minded about all of these things that I used to think were either marketing schemes or stupid things that people still do because they've done it that way the whole time and they never learned how to
Mhm.
do it better. I just don't believe either of those sentiments very much, at least not as much as I used to.
Well, and I would imagine anyone who feels like there is no gain from or no change from agitation, maybe not
Yes.
gain, but no change from agitation, I would say has probably never made a vinaigrette in their life, right?
Good point.
Because oil and water don't go together well until you agitate them, right?
Yep.
And so now you've created a dressing that will only hold that suspension for a period of time, and then it's
Yep.
going to separate again, right? And so there is something that will happen to a liquid if it is agitated. I mean, they use it in
Totally.
chemistry sets all the time. Whenever you're trying to mingle two things together, you should either stir it, right? You got to, and sometimes it's like you stir it one direction, you never change direction, right? That's another thing that happens in chemistry. So this is a thing that's proven. What is the impact? We don't know, and it's all a
Right.
giant guessing
Totally.
game. But it's a great place to explore, and I agree. I think Jefferson's was a great marketing idea that is probably generating something. And then you've got O.H. Ingram, who's doing River Aged, right, and they've got their own thing, and it's a less agitation, but it's maybe a longer period of time, and um, it's experimentation. It's finding things that um, maybe we knew before, like the Madeira thing, and I'm absolutely digging that information up. That may become an episode for me in the future, is like looking at that specifically, because I did one on different aging methods, and there was a group of people that I want to say it was in England, that they buried a barrel of whiskey like 10 feet under the ground and then dug it up a year later to see what the impact from that particular
Yeah.
environmental influences to aging are always going to be a part of the impact. And if being in a rick house and the heat cycles is going to change it, if you put it in the equivalent of a rick house where there's heat cycling as well as agitation from
Totally.
rocking, probably going to make a
Probably
difference
gonna
too.
do something. Yeah.
I mean, it may not
Yeah.
be better, and it may not be
Might not be better, but
significantly better
yeah,
or worse, right? It may
totally.
not be huge, but there's going to be something. But we also won't know, because there's no way to create a blind and neutral portion of that test, right?
Yep.
There's no way. Like, you put it in a vacuum and then it's not doing anything, right? So how can you test it? You can get some ideas to get close, but
That's
yeah, I think you
that's
got some.
and that's one of the cool things. So for us, I think one of the cool things is we now have we have a budding liquid library, right?
Mhm.
Where not just like, hey, okay, we have some blends. We have we have whiskey where we've pulled samples from a sherry butt, 6 times over the course of a year and change, right? We have already starting at a certain age, and um, you don't draw hard conclusions from that. You just draw
Mhm.
directionality. And so the fun thing about the really fun thing about doing these different types of further maturations, like, look, making the batches is one of the coolest things we do. I think it's one of the most fun aspects of the whiskey industry is the opportunity to blend and create a final product just by blending components, right? Um, but there's something that's very precise about that. You get to kind of go, okay, here's the design, and then we scale it up, and we just try to keep it as true to the original design as we can. The When you do these things like Peregrine, or when we do these further maturations, you only have directionality, and then you're constantly making judgment calls based on intuition, faith, like, like, and and so you refer to the liquid library, and we sit there and we go, okay, this is doing this good thing. Is it going to keep doing that, or is it not? Well, what do we have that's like it, or that we can go and refer to? And then you look at it, and then that gives you a sense of directionality. But then you keep tasting it, and you keep sort of making that constant judgment call of, do we bottle this sucker, or do we, take it out of wood and maybe we're going to blend it with something, or do we let it go? Do we keep letting it go? And that part of that unknown aspect of the journey is it's super exciting. I mean, it's super exciting. And I'll give you one example. I'll give you is one of the things that is plays a big role in further maturation is what the previous spirit was. And that seems obvious, right? It's like, okay, well, if you have something that has standing liquid of sherry, you're going to get a lot of sherry influence when you put liquid in there. Duh, obviously. But what's interesting is, how did the previous spirit or previous wine interact with the wood, and how does
Mhm.
that dictate what's left in the wood? So one example here is ethanolysis versus hydrolysis, right? So if you take if you take an ex Malbec cask and you put liquid in there, the wine that was in there, say it was 15% alcohol by volume. Well, you've had a wholly disproportionate amount of water interaction with wood versus alcohol interaction with wood. And so what we've found that's been fascinating is, when we do things like use a cognac barrel, the spirit that was in there was pretty high in alcohol content. So when we put another spirit in there that's relatively similar, we're seeing a relatively linear behavior in maturation. If it's getting sweeter, then it continues to get sweeter. If it's getting more acid, then it continues to get more acid, right? Like, these things are there. It's not even, it's not perfect, but we are seeing some level of, like, this is happening and we expect it to happen. When you throw something that's 65% alcohol by volume into a barrel that's been hosting something that is 15% alcohol by volume, these fuckers go everywhere. They first interact with the liquid that's in there, but then, like, the previous spirit was so water driven that all of a sudden you get way more tannin, but then it evens out, and so the wine barrels, when we've used them, are super scary. They're It's like very intimidating to age with them, because the directionality is not linear, and they get better, and then they get a little worse, and then they get way better, and you're like, when they got better the first time, it's like the stock market, right? You're like,
Yep.
oh fuck, I should have sold. Like, and
Right.
it's going down, and you're like, is it going to turn around? And then it turns around and goes way higher to a new peak, and you sit there, and again, you're always in this buy sell mode. You're like, do we sell now? Do we sell? It could crash at any moment, you know.
Mhm.
Wine barrels are like playing the stock market, whereas, like, spirits barrels are like, trading bonds. It's a
Right.
different, it's a totally different thing.
It's investing in like Dogecoin versus Disney.
I
It's gonna feel pretty straightforward, and That makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't heard it framed quite that way. And I've talked to a number of people who do secondary aging, and they've talked about this barrel starting to go downhill, so you just let it go because it's bad. Maybe it turns around, and maybe it becomes something that you end up cleaning the floors with, right? Because it's got
Yep.
enough proof to do so.
Yep.
Um, and we're pushing up on 3 hours, and I'm about to have children start showing up at my front door, so I'm going to
Good.
leave maybe like
This is
one more
perfect.
question here
Yeah,
for
yeah,
you,
yeah.
and then we'll have to do this again because I think I've got at
Hell
least a
yes.
dozen more questions. Um, you're talking about further maturation and using barrels and different types of spirits. Is there a and you mentioned the one that's really popular right now way earlier. You're talking about Amburana
Yeah.
being the barrel du jour at this point. But is there a barrel type, type of wood or a spirit type that you haven't had a chance to work with yet that you're like, man, I want that one. I want that, like Armagnac or something else. Like, is there one out there that you're like, we got to figure out how to make that happen?
Yeah, so Armagnacs really interesting. I would love to do Armagnac. A little bit the way the brandy industry works. It's much easier to source cognac barrels than Armagnac barrels,
Hmm.
because the way cognac works is you have all these different vintners who are making cognac and then selling it to the 4 or 5 big houses, right? And so they're
Hmm.
buying the barrels, blending it together, and making Hennessy or Cavassier or whatever the cognac is, Hein, right? And then they have the barrels and they have a lot of them, and so those make it to barrel brokers and things like that. So you can get access to cognac, and you can get pretty steady, good access to good cognac barrels. Armagnac's like 1,000 little minute little producers that make 4 barrels a year. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so they use the wood, and there isn't this like robust market for good quality secondary market Armagnac barrels. They exist, but it's one that I would absolutely love to play around with. Brandy barrels have done some of the best stuff that we've made, and some of the best components we've had have been brandy barrels. I think it's really sort of it's kind of a natural fit. I I love port. Like, to be honest, we've used some port stuff, and we'll use more port barrels. And I love port. I love it. I mean, I like
Hmm.
I like drinking it. I like bathing in it. Like, I like port a lot, and so if I like to bathe in port, I figure that my whiskey would like to bathe in port. Um, no, we've done it. I would definitely go back to that. There's something about the rye spice that you pick up when you use rye at all, and how it interacts. It's Rye is always a little astringent, and can get a little bitter, and so rye is always a fight, right? You're the more flavor you get, it's a sword that cuts both ways. The more flavor you get, you're often getting more of that astringency and that bitterness. And so the fruit and sweetness of port pipes does miracles to that, right? There's a reason why rye and port works so bloody well. It's because they're like peanut butter and jelly. They contrast each other in a really natural way. So as we dabble more with rye and with adapting rye, I will go back to using port. But that's not really your question. You're looking for the more interesting stuff that I'm dying to mess around with. And for me, I really would like to mess around with more dessert wine barrels.
Hmm.
Um, the stuff that we've done in Muscat and Sauternes has been absolutely delicious. Um, the profile is a bit of a stretch, to be honest. Like, I think it often doesn't do the like dark, um God, just thinking colors here. It doesn't do like the dark jammy stuff that sherry and Madeira
Hmm.
and port tend to do. It's much more on the brighter champagne grapes, creme brulee kind of interesting stuff. And I think that can get cloying in whiskey if it's not done just right. So I'm very intrigued by that, and would like to I would like to dabble in that. Whether that becomes like its own second summit, or whether
Hmm.
that becomes a component that we could really build the whiskey around, I'm not sure yet. But I'm very intrigued. I'm very intrigued, which is funny because I don't like dessert wine at all when I
Mhm.
drink it. It's not something I like to drink, but it is something that I really like as when it's done well as a finishing device.
Yeah, and the Sauternes is one that we don't I don't see as much of in whiskey, or at least in American whiskey for that matter, because I think it's delicate in nature and it's hard to fight its way out of the dark notes and the strong notes that
Totally.
exist in a lot of bourbons. And if you make that one, let me know when, so that way I can have the website queued up, because I know when you guys go to sell stuff, it goes really, really, really fast. Um,
Yeah. That okay, I want to wrap on that because
mhm.
I want to wrap up on that, not
Yep.
wrap on it as in
Yeah.
talk about it. Although yeah, a little double entendre at work there. No, so this is something we talk a lot about. This is something we've been talking a lot about as a company recently because look, we made the first batches. They sold well, but like nobody knew who we were. They sat around on shelves. You could still find
Mhm.
them for a while. We made 3 and 4. You could still find 3 here and there on shelves. Occasionally, you might find a bottle of 4. We made 5 and 6. They took 6 months to start to really sell out. Again, like if you dig around, you go to Illinois, you go to Binny's, you can find pretty much everything we've made.
Mhm.
Like you can still sort of find these. Then we made 7 and it sold out really fast. For us, we were like, oh shit, this is gone in a couple weeks. And then we made 8 and it sold out at least online in a day. But we've also, based on market feedback and distributors and retailers being like, hey, can I get any more? Obviously, it's also selling through. And then we make Peregrine, it sells out in a minute. And so like how are we supposed to feel about that? And what are we supposed to do going forward? Is a genuine question that we discuss as a company. And on one hand, like on one hand, the there is zero question that selling out is is there are very good things about selling out. It's a good problem to have. It's way better than the alternative, than the other side of
Mhm.
the spectrum. But in all honesty, like we're like we're incredibly grateful, right? It's amazing that people believe in the project, that believe in what we're doing, and there are enough people that this thing is selling out. Um, and there's no question that we're very happy about that piece of it. On the other hand, like I have received a lot of emails from people being like, I have batches 1 through 7 and I couldn't get 8.
Yeah.
Um, that sucks. Like I seriously. And we don't want we don't try to be a brand that creates artificial scarcity for the sake of,
Mhm.
it's like, oh, we know that there are 1,000 people who want this, so we're going to make 500 bottles of it, and
Right.
throw red meat in a pen full of wolves and see what happens. There's like that's not what we're trying to do. That's not what we're
Mhm.
trying to do at all. And on top of it, like um, this brand has been built by us, obviously, but also by a lot of people. A
Mhm.
lot of people, a lot of retailers, a lot of reviewers, a lot of whiskey writers, but more than gets appreciated, a lot of customers who just have put their own little personal whiskey reputation on the line when they pour bottles of Found North for their whiskey friends, and they say, you don't think you like Canadian, but I want to show you this and I want you to take a chance on it, and here it is. And I bought it and I support these guys, and I believe in their story. And so to make whiskey that they can't get sucks.
Mhm.
It does. It actually sucks. And there are projects that we do that in order to make them, they have to be limited editions. The second summits have to be limited editions. We're basically doing little 1, 2 barrel experiments. Like there's no way to make that globally available. But as we move forward with things like batches, you know, we have to consider, and we are considering, can we make these batches bigger?
Mhm.
And can we do it and preserve the quality? And how do we do that without just how do we do that and make sure that the whiskey still up to the standard that we want for Found North, being very cognizant of the fact that like these are selling out faster, great, but we still want them to be available to both people who've been on this journey the whole time, but also like, what the fuck is the point of people going, hey, this whiskey's great, and somebody's like, wow, thanks for the recommendation. I'm going to go online and find out that I can't get it, and if I want to
Right.
buy it, I got to get it on Cask Cartel for $300. That's not exactly what we're going for here. So that's a really interesting piece of this that we haven't figured out and that we're working on.
Yeah, and I think there's some transparency that exists, and so we go back to that term, and we can probably finish on that. But if you go back and look, each one of the blends will give you a rough idea of how many bottles were in that, right?
Yes.
And you don't see a significant change up or down in these values over the last 3 or 4 blends, right? Because
Yep.
you're blending to that same thing. And so for the people that have that, and it sounds terrible, but it's refreshing to see someone have the reaction that we sold out and it's good and bad, right? Because it's harming the people that have been with us from day one, right? The people that have continued to support us, but those same people have the opportunity to go and look and say, okay, these Peregrine is a special edition, so it's a smaller setup than maybe some of their other ones were. But batch 8, batch 7, batch 6 are all batch 8, batch 7, and first batch 6 are all roughly the same size and volume, right? You're
3,000
going to have
to
fluctuations
3,500
because
bottles.
that's what comes
Yep.
out of the barrel or whatever,
Yep.
but they're roughly the same size. We're just getting more popular, and it's not easy to scale and understand what the next level is going to be, because you could say, all right, let's just say, for batch 8, there's 2,900 bottles that were in that particular outturn. You crank it up to 7,000 for batch 9 and you sell 4,000, which is an increase in your sales from this one.
Right. It's
But
a
now you're
big fucking
3,000
problem.
bottles, right? So you're in an unenviable position because you want to continue success and you want to continue to, but you don't want to put a bunch of product that sits on a shelf for 6 months, because that is
Right.
lost revenue at that point, right?
But
And so,
yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
no, that was kind of the basic, the
No,
end
and
of it is
and
like, it's good to see a producer who cares about that, but for the person who has 1 through 7, they also have the capability to understand. And there's probably somebody specific who's like, you know what, fuck that John guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's fine. You're right, I don't. But they can self-serve this data that I've been able to understand and say, no, it's not Nick, it's not Sammy, it's not any of these guys that are trying to artificially restrict. It's the interest is now outstripping what they made, and so they're going to adjust and they're going to make some more. Maybe the next batch is 4,000 bottles instead of 3,000 bottles. And maybe they sell it in 10 minutes, and maybe they sell it in 2 days, and maybe they sell it in 60 seconds.
right.
All it tells me is that I'm in on the ground floor of something that makes sense. And if you still got some of that batch 1, you could probably find somebody with batch 8 and trade them samples. Guarantee it.
True. Yeah.
Because that
And
person with batch 8 may not have batch 1.
well, I think you nailed it, right? Because on one end, like if we make 7,000 bottles and we sell 4,000, we've got a big problem. On the flip side, and my brother asked me this today, and the way I responded was, he said, okay, you make batch we make batch 9, what do you want to happen, right? Like what do you want to actually happen? And the answer across the room was, we all said, well, we wanted to sell out, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, but the nuance that we got into was, look, if you sell out of batch 9 and 10% of people who wanted it got a bottle, and you sell out batch 9 and 95% of people who want a bottle got a bottle, those are still the same number of sales. So in a
Mm-hmm.
way, they look like they're the same outcome, but the latter's way better than the former. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so the tricky thing here for us is, no matter what, we won't do anything to compromise the quality. So if
Yep.
we have to make 3,000 bottle batches to maintain the quality we're at, like, sorry everyone, that's where we're at, and we'll never start compromising that.
Artificially
Period.
inflating for bottle count.
No, but
Yeah.
but look, if other people can make as miraculously good whiskey as I've tasted at a much larger scale, I believe that we can too.
Mm-hmm.
So my feeling is there's room for us to grow and stay at or actually even improve the quality. So I think that's kind of the goal, and I think we can do that. Um, but I think like if we can find a way to be we're our price point makes us an exclusive product, but
Hmm.
honestly, our attitude is that we want to be an inclusive brand. If people want to get on the ride, we want them to be able to get a seat on the ride. And that's that. Like I just that's in our ethos, and that's what we're going to try to do.
Yeah.
We're going to make limited
Yeah.
edition stuff, and we're going to have to figure out what the hell to do about that. We're going to do 1-2 barrel things, and we're going to do Peregrine where, God, I don't know how much bigger we could have made Peregrine, and like that's a reality of it. But we can do it with batches, and we can do it with other releases. We're going to try to make it so that everybody can get on the ride.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, I don't know that consumers can ask for too much more because there are people that absolutely will create artificial scarcity, but largely the people that are capable of doing that are the large scale producers, right?
Yeah,
Because at the end of the day, you've got to lay down enough liquid. Like if you're going to do a secondary maturation, you got to lay down enough liquid that at the end of next summer you have something to work with, right? And so you're doing that projection, whereas a large scale producer has thousands, if not tens of thousands of barrels available any given day, right? And so they
right.
could increase, and there's no way that in that 10,000 barrels there's not 1,000 of them that could come together for what would be considered a very, very, very um,
High end
limited
and coveted.
release,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then creates, if it's 1,000 barrels and there's 250 bottles per barrel, there's a lot of cases of alcohol that are
That's a lot
available
of
there,
liquid.
right? Now, we're talking about blends that, if I look at 3,000 bottles or 4,000 bottles, if I do some math,
Doing the
and
math.
say it's 10, 11, 12, maybe 13 barrels, depending upon how much they come out of it, it's a different scale. And it's not like you're sitting on thousands of barrels to be able to add in at the last
That
minute.
all
Oh,
taste the
shit, we need a
same.
little.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
That don't impact the flavor or the
Right.
outcome. And so I think that I would, and I'm going to finish it here. Like, thank you, Nick, for the time. I
Thank you.
don't think that you guys should change anything you're doing. You scale where you think you can, but keeping the central identity, the signature style, what you're doing, um, is what's going to continue to make this successful. We are going to have to talk again sometime in the next
Yes. Looking
couple
forward to
months
it.
because there's a whole lot more here. I mean,
Good.
we're at 3 hours. And I feel like there's at least two more hours sitting here, but
Oh yeah.
I'm going to have to get children. I'm going to have to do, familial things. But thank you absolutely for giving me 3 hours of your time today.
No, thank you.
You guys are putting out a fantastic product, and it feels like it came out of nowhere and then it just hit hard, and that's always great. It's always great for us.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. Well, thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to the next conversation.
Thanks for tuning in for this offering from the Embellish podcast. It was a long one, but I think it was quite fruitful. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you are consuming this on. Leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media at TikTok or Instagram using Embellish Pod, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can also be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, contact details, and more. Thanks for stopping by today. UK basketball fans are almost as bad as Tennessee football fans, which are almost as bad as Duke basketball fans. Like, they're all sort of the same person, but living in Kentucky, that's a dangerous thing to say. Like, it scares the bejesus out of people.
All right. So I went to Davidson in North Carolina, and so
Okay.
the Duke UNC thing, it was always hilarious. Like we were pretty good at, I was there when Steph Curry was there. We were pretty good at basketball, and yet when
Hmm.
UNC would play Duke, the whole campus would be covered in blue and white. It was hilarious, right?
Yep.
It's like, oh, and man, there were some fights. It was hilarious, and it's like we're literally on Davidson
Another
campus, and this
campus.
is happening.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So it used to be at our, at the university here in town, at their basketball games, they would highlight people that would show up to that game wearing UK or U of L, right? Because it's like, that's a 6 hour drive from here, and the people in
Yep.
Lexington don't give a shit about you
Yeah, yeah.
at all. Like, they don't, like, that university doesn't. Now, if you got a kid at that school, I get it, right? But most of the people here don't. Like, there's not a ton of kids that
Right.
go to UK from here, and so it's just like because it's a blue blood and it's in your state, you support it.
Yep.
But those are
Yep.
the
Yep. Yep.
obnoxious assholes every single time.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Oh my god. Oh man. Oh, that's fun.
All right, so we'll do an introduction part now, right? Now that we
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready.
get a couple minutes here. All right, so